The hill outside Jerusalem had never been so silent. The crowds had vanished, the soldiers had gone, and only the wind remained, carrying with it the echo of a cry that had torn heaven and earth in two. The sky that afternoon had turned black, as though creation itself could not bear to watch. And there, at the foot of the cross, a mother had stood longer than anyone else. Her name was Mary. No one recorded her words, none dared to ask what she saw when the world ended before her eyes. They only remembered that when the final breath left her son's body, she did not faint, did not scream, did not flee. She simply looked upward, her hands trembling but steady, as if even in that agony she knew something the rest of them did not. When the body was taken down and laid in a borrowed tomb, when the stone rolled shut and the Sabbath fell like a heavy curtain, she disappeared from sight. The Gospels that once followed her so closely fall silent. We hear nothing of her after the resurrection, nothing of her during the years that followed. Scripture, so detailed about miracles and martyrs, says not one word about the woman who had once carried God in her arms. It is a silence that has haunted history. What happened to Mary after the cross? Was she taken into hiding, like the apostles who feared the empire's wrath? Did she live out her days in quiet service, content to vanish from the world she once transformed? Or was there, as ancient writings suggest, a secret known to only a few, one that heaven itself kept hidden? Before we open today's scroll, take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It helps us keep these in-depth stories of faith, history, and mystery alive. And as always, let us know where in the world you're watching from. This channel has become a global fellowship of seekers, historians, believers, and thinkers united by curiosity. Now take a deep breath and step with me into the pages of time. After the crucifixion, Mary was entrusted to the care of John, the beloved disciple. That much the Gospel of John tells us plainly. From that moment forward, she lived not as the mother of the Messiah, but as the quiet witness to everything that had been fulfilled. Some early traditions say she remained in Jerusalem, staying near the Mount of Olives, where her son had ascended into heaven. Others claim she journeyed with John to Ephesus, the ancient city that still holds a lonely stone house believed to have sheltered her final years. The trail of history splits here, Jerusalem and Ephesus, two paths that both lead to an empty tomb. In Jerusalem, beneath centuries of dust and devotion, stands a crypt in the Kidron Valley. Its entrance lies between olive trees carved deep into the earth. Pilgrims have walked down its worn steps for nearly 2,000 years, claiming it to be the place where the Virgin Mary was laid to rest. Candles burn there without ceasing. Yet those who first opened the tomb found no body inside, only the scent of myrrh, only flowers said to have bloomed where her body once lay. Thousands of miles away, near Ephesus in modern-day Turkey, another story took root. There, high in the hills, stands a small stone dwelling surrounded by cypress trees. Local tradition, preserved by both Christians and Muslims, claims it to be the home where the mother of Jesus lived her last days under John's protection. When archaeologists rediscovered it in the 19th century, they found the foundation of a structure that matched descriptions from visions of a German mystic. Details she could not have known. 2 tombs, 2 stories, 1 woman. The question lingers. Did she die at all? The first generations of believers pondered that very question. In their writings, letters, hymns, and secret homilies, they began to describe not a death but a falling asleep. They called it the dormition, a word that means rest, not ending. The Mother of God, they said, did not suffer corruption. She closed her eyes, and angels carried her soul into the arms of her Son. But if this was true, if she was taken from the world without decay, why did the Church never record it in the Gospels? Some say it was too sacred to write. Others believe it was spoken of only in the inner circles of the early faithful, whispered in liturgy but never set to ink. The apostles themselves, according to old Eastern texts, gathered to witness her final breath. They tell of light filling the room, of music from unseen choirs, and of her face shining with peace. The apocryphal text, Transitus Mariae, preserved in fragments, describes what happened next. The Lord said, "Rise up, my beloved, my dove, my undefiled one. The time has come to the place prepared for you from the beginning of the world." And at those words it says her body shone like the sun, and her soul was lifted from it like fragrance from a flower. It is an image that has endured for nearly 2 millennia. The mother's body, cradled by angels, carried upward in glory, the heavens parting to receive her. Yet this vision is not simply legend. For the early Christians it was testimony. They believed it not because they saw it with their eyes, but because they found no body left behind. In a world obsessed with relics, bones, garments, fragments of saints, no one ever claimed possession of Mary's remains. Not in Rome, not in Jerusalem, not anywhere. In a faith that built shrines around every martyr's grave, her absence became its own proof. Something had happened that history could not fully capture. Even the silence of Scripture began to make sense. The Gospels, written decades after her lifetime, were not chronicles of death but of revelation. To reveal what happened to her, some believed, would have been to reveal a secret too radiant for mortal understanding. Centuries later, when theologians began to debate her fate, the pattern of evidence was impossible to ignore. No tomb, no relic, no mourning, ritual ever recorded. Only stories of light, only hymns that spoke of the Queen of Heaven rising beyond the stars. In the East, they painted icons of her surrounded by the apostles, lying upon a bier as Christ receives her soul, not as a ghost, but as a child of light. The scene mirrors Bethlehem in reverse. The son now holding the mother, life completing the circle of love. Even those who doubted her assumption could not deny her mystery. For Mary had already crossed every boundary that separates human from divine. She had carried within her the infinite, and in doing so had become the living bridge between heaven and earth. Perhaps then it is fitting that her story ends not with a grave, but with a question mark glowing like a star. Where did she go? Historians trace the earliest mention of her dormition to writings from the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Texts found in Coptic and Syriac fragments, later translated into Greek and Latin. These were not mere legends spun for comfort. They reflected the faith of communities who remembered her not as absent, but as present in a new form. And there are those who claim to have seen her even after death. Visionaries in Egypt, Byzantium, and later in Europe all spoke of the Mother of God appearing in times of crisis, her voice urging repentance, her hands raised in intercession. In each account she was radiant, yet human, clothed not in myth but in compassion. It is as though her departure from the world was not a vanishing, but a transformation. The silence after the cross was not absence, it was preparation. The story that began in a stable beneath starlight was about to end in radiance beyond measure, because perhaps heaven had one final secret left to tell. Mary's disappearance from history is not a gap, it is an invitation. The same silence that concealed her fate calls us to look deeper, not into the pages of books, but into the faith that remembers what cannot be written. In that silence you can almost hear it. The sound of wings, the faint echo of a mother's voice whispering through eternity. Be not afraid, where I have gone, you shall one day follow. The dust settles. The story does not end. Somewhere between heaven's glory and earth's memory, the Mother of God remains, waiting for those willing to listen beyond words, to hear the truth that history dared not speak aloud. And as we turn the next page of this mystery, we will follow the faint trail she left behind, the hidden years that carried her from Jerusalem to the edge of the world and perhaps beyond it. The silence after the cross fades into another kind of stillness, one not born of grief, but of endurance. The world has changed. The stone that sealed death has been rolled away, and the followers of the risen Christ scatter like sparks across the known world. Yet one spark does not move. She remains, a mother without a son, a witness without a voice, living somewhere in the shadow between history and heaven, after the fire of Pentecost descended upon the apostles. When the Holy Spirit filled the upper room and tongues of flame danced above their heads, the Bible falls silent once again about her. The woman who was there when the Word became flesh is also there when the church is born in fire, yet after that moment the sacred text lets her fade back into quiet. We know only one thing for certain. Christ entrusted her to John, saying from the cross, "Behold your mother." And from that hour John took her into his care. But where did that care lead her? Some say Jerusalem, the city of memory, the city of pain. Others insist Ephesus, far across the Aegean Sea, where John later preached and where a small stone house stands to this day, its air heavy with incense and legend. Two traditions, two destinies, both ancient, both passionate. And between them the story of the most mysterious woman in history drifts like incense smoke, refusing to be pinned down. Imagine her in those hidden years, no longer young but not yet frail. Her hair threaded with silver, her eyes still holding that quiet strength that had faced angels and executioners alike. The disciples came to her for counsel, for comfort, for the kind of wisdom that can only come from one who has seen the face of God asleep in her arms. They called her Theotokos, God-bearer, even before the councils made it doctrine. In Jerusalem, early believers built their first meeting places near Mount Zion. Tradition holds that Mary lived there with John, in a modest dwelling close to the upper room where the Last Supper had taken place. Pilgrims who came centuries later claim to have seen the foundation stones of her house, still kissed by the shadows of the olive trees that once knew her footsteps. But another path just as ancient leads west, to Ephesus in Asia Minor. The story begins with John's mission to that city, one of the largest and most cosmopolitan centers of the ancient world. Ephesus was a place of marble temples, bustling markets, and mystics who whispered to the wind. It was also home to one of the seven wonders, the great temple of Artemis, goddess of fertility and protector of women. How strange, and yet how fitting, that the Mother of God would live in a place once dedicated to the Mother Goddess of the Old World. In that overlap of faiths, something remarkable happened. When Mary came to Ephesus, she didn't erase the old reverence for the divine feminine, she fulfilled it. The people who once prayed to Artemis began to whisper another name, Maria. Some scholars believe this helped early Christianity take root among the Greeks, bridging the divide between heaven's ancient symbols and the new revelation of grace. The small house said to be hers stands on a wooded hill called Nightingale Mountain, where the air is cool and the spring water flows sweet. The structure itself is simple, a single-room stone dwelling with an arched roof and a hearth in the corner. Archaeologists studying its foundations found stones from the 1st century, older than the later Byzantine restorations. When rediscovered in the 19th century, it matched with eerie precision the visions of a bedridden German mystic named Anne Catherine Emmerich, who had described it decades earlier without ever leaving Europe. In her visions, Mary lived there with John, weaving linen by day and praying by candlelight at night. She spent her final years in contemplation, visited by pilgrims and apostles who sought her blessing. When her time came, Emmerich said her passing was serene, her face radiant, her soul lifted as if carried by unseen hands. Skeptics dismissed it as legend. Yet when explorers followed her descriptions into the hills above Ephesus, they found the ruins exactly where she said they would be. Even the spring she mentioned still flowed nearby. The coincidence, or providence, was impossible to ignore. Still, the Jerusalem tradition holds fast. The ancient church of the Dormition, built by early Christians in the Kidron Valley, claims to mark her true resting place. Its walls bear inscriptions older than any other Marian shrine. In the 4th century, Saint Juvenal, Bishop of Jerusalem, testified that when the tomb was opened 3 days after her burial, it was found empty, save for the linens that had wrapped her body. His words echo what countless generations have believed, that she did not remain in the earth. Both stories, Jerusalem and Ephesus, speak of light, of peace, of a body untouched by decay. Both end with an empty tomb. And that, perhaps, is the point. The contradiction is not a flaw, but a feature, a way of saying that her story belongs to all lands and no land, to all people and no one nation. She had once carried within her the Creator himself. It would be strange indeed if the earth could claim to hold her now. The early church never debated whether she was holy. They debated only how far her holiness reached. Did she die as all mortals must? Or was she, as the Eastern Fathers wrote, taken in sleep before death could touch her? The question mattered not because of curiosity, but because it touched the heart of theology itself, what it meant for humanity to be redeemed in flesh. If the Son of God rose from the grave, then what of the mother who bore him? Could the body that first housed divine life be left to dust? Writings from the 4th and 5th centuries suggest that believers saw her as the first fruit of resurrection, the sign of what awaited all who followed Christ. In the hymns of Saint Ephrem the Syrian, she is called the ark that could not be sunk, the garden that knew no winter, the earth that yielded its child to heaven. It is said that near the end of her life she felt a restlessness, not of fear but of longing. The same yearning she once felt as a girl in Nazareth when she said yes to the angel's voice returned to her now in old age, whispering again, "Come." Whether she sat beneath the olive trees of Jerusalem or the cypress shade of Ephesus, she knew her time on earth was drawing to a close. The apostles, scattered across distant lands, somehow sensed it too. Ancient texts tell that they were carried by divine power to her side, each appearing from far corners of the world, Peter from Rome, Andrew from Greece, Thomas from India. The air shimmered with light, a fragrance filled the room. They say she greeted them not as a dying woman, but as a mother welcoming her sons home. The writings called the Transitus describe that moment with tender awe. And Mary lifted her eyes to heaven and said, "Let my soul rejoice in thee, O God, for thou hast regarded thy lowly handmaid." And behold, her son came with a multitude of angels, and he received her soul in his hands. Some accounts say her body was laid in a tomb prepared by the apostles themselves. Others claim she vanished before their eyes, leaving only her burial cloth behind. But perhaps both are true. Perhaps, like her son, she entered death only to transform it. The earliest Christians did not speak of her as dead, but as glorified. They called her not a goddess, but a promise, the first human to complete the journey of redemption. Her hidden years were not years of obscurity, but of preparation. Each quiet prayer, each day spent in the ordinary rhythm of life, was a step toward transfiguration. In her stillness she reflected the mystery of the church itself, present yet unseen, suffering yet radiant, human yet divine in destiny. The silence surrounding her life was the silence before revelation, the breath drawn before the final word is spoken. Historians might call these tales folklore, but the heart of faith beats in the space between evidence and wonder. Whether in the shadowed hills of Ephesus or the sunlit stones of Jerusalem, the truth remains the same. She lived, she loved, she endured. And when the hour came, heaven reached for her as a child reaches for its mother. The world never witnessed her funeral. There were no mourners, no monuments carved with her name. Only memories that shimmered like mirages in the minds of those who had known her. And yet, wherever her story traveled, to Egypt, to Byzantium, to the far reaches of the West, it carried the same fragrance, peace, purity, and the impossible hope that death is not the end. When pilgrims walk today into her house in Ephesus, the air feels strangely alive. The walls seem to breathe, the silence dense and kind. Candles flicker beside her simple stone bed, and through a small window, light spills onto the floor like liquid gold. Some say they hear the sound of wings in the distance, others a whisper of prayer that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It is said that in her final days, Mary gazed at the horizon each evening as the sun sank behind the hills, her lips moving in silent song. What did she see in that fading light? Perhaps not the end of her life, but the beginning of eternity. And so the hidden years come to a close, not with the sound of weeping, but with the music of surrender. The world may never know whether her last breath was drawn in Jerusalem or in Ephesus. But somewhere between those two places, between memory and mystery, a mother's heart still beats in the rhythm of faith. The next chapter of her story would not be written in ink or carved in stone. It would be written in the heavens themselves, in a vision of light that would change how the faithful saw death forever. The story of Mary's final hours, like her life, moves quietly, without spectacle, without thunder. Her hidden years, spent in prayer and obscurity, melt into something softer still. A peace that feels less like death and more like rest. The early believers had a word for this rest, a word that captured not grief but serenity. They called it koimesis, in Greek the falling asleep. And so began the tradition the East would treasure for centuries, the dormition of the Mother of God. It is an image that feels ancient even to the ancients. Angels descending like snowflakes of light, the room filled with fragrance, and the apostles gathered around the bed of the woman who had once cradled the Creator. The earliest hymns describe the air trembling with music unseen, Mary's eyes closing not in pain but in wonder, her breathing slowing, her heart yielding to the rhythm of eternity. For those who told this story, death was not an ending, but a homecoming. They believed her Son came personally to receive her soul, an intimacy no mortal death had ever known. The first mention of this mystery appears not in the Bible, but in apocryphal writings that circulated among Christian communities in the 4th and 5th centuries. Texts like the Book of the Dormition of Mary, the Transitus Mariae, and the Liber Requiem Mariae unfold like sacred poetry, half vision, half testimony. They describe how one night an angel appeared to Mary while she prayed, holding a palm branch glowing with unearthly light. The angel said, "Your time has come. Your son awaits you." She did not resist. She did not ask for more years, more breath. She only said, "Behold the handmaid of the Lord," echoing the words she had spoken as a young girl in Nazareth when eternity first entered her womb. From that moment, time itself seemed to slow. The apostles, far scattered across the world, felt a strange stirring in their spirits. The writings say they were lifted by divine power, some carried by clouds, others by beams of light, until they stood once again together beside her. Peter from Rome, Andrew from Greece, Matthew from Ethiopia, Thomas from the edge of India. Each one drawn across oceans and deserts to witness her final hour. They found her surrounded by a light too soft to be earthly. Some said it was as if dawn had entered her home and never left. She greeted them one by one, blessing them, speaking not of sorrow but of joy. "Let not your hearts be troubled," she told them, "for my body will sleep, but my soul will see life everlasting." And then, as they sang psalms, her eyes turned upward. She smiled. The room grew brighter, and her soul, pure, weightless, radiant, rose from her body like perfume rising from a garden in bloom. The apostles, trembling, lifted her body and placed it in a stone tomb prepared on the Mount of Olives. For 3 days they kept watch, singing hymns as stars wheeled silently overhead. Then Thomas, the one who had doubted, arrived late. When he begged to see her one last time, the others rolled away the stone. The tomb was empty. Only the fragrance of flowers remained. The Eastern Church would later weave this vision into its very calendar. Every year, on the 15th day of August, believers would gather to sing hymns of light, to lay lilies before her icon, to remember not death, but dormition. Their songs spoke of peace rather than mourning. "In giving birth, you kept your virginity," they sang. "In your dormition, you did not forsake the world, O Theotokos." The West would come to call this mystery the Assumption, emphasizing her being taken up into heaven. But centuries before that word existed, the East had already preserved the tenderness of the moment, the falling asleep, the stillness before glory. It is easy to forget that these early Christians did not see themselves as inventing myths. To them, these were memories passed from the apostles to their disciples, from the first believers to the next. They read the story not as embellishment, but as continuation, the fulfillment of what Scripture had hinted, that the one who bore life itself could not be conquered by death. Yet the question remains, if this story held such power, why did it never enter the canon of Scripture? The answer lies partly in timing. By the time the Gospels were written, between the decades after the resurrection and the end of the 1st century, Mary had already passed into mystery. Her final days, known intimately by only a few, existed not as public event, but as private revelation. The Church, still young and persecuted, focused on spreading the message of salvation through Christ's resurrection, not on explaining what happened to his mother. Moreover, early Christians were cautious with visions and apocrypha. They distinguished between revelation that applied to all, the gospel, and revelation given to a few as comfort. The dormition belonged to the latter. It was never meant as doctrine to argue, but as mystery to revere. Still the story spread, quietly at first, then with growing certainty. By the 6th century, entire churches were being built in Jerusalem and Constantinople to honor the event. The Feast of the Dormition became one of the great liturgical celebrations of the Eastern world. Emperors attended, bishops preached, choirs sang of the mother who had fallen asleep and awakened in glory. And yet, for all its beauty, the West remained cautious. Rome preferred silence to speculation. The Scriptures said nothing, and for many centuries that silence was sacred. To speak of her Assumption without clear proof felt to some like trespassing into mystery. But for the Eastern Fathers, silence was not absence. It was reverence. What was too holy for ink could still be painted in gold and song. Icons of the Dormition appeared. Mary lying peacefully upon a bier, surrounded by apostles in mourning, while above her Christ holds a small child clothed in white. That child, the artist said, was her soul, innocent, newborn into eternal life. The imagery is astonishing. The Son who was once cradled in his mother's arms now cradles her in his. Birth and death trade places, heaven and earth close their circle. In these icons, even grief is gentle. The apostles are sorrowful, yet their faces glow with quiet faith. They know what her still body represents, the seed of resurrection already blooming. The flowers placed beside her are not symbols of loss, but of spring. For the early believers, the Dormition revealed something profound about the destiny of all humanity. If Mary, a daughter of Eve, could enter heaven body and soul, then the promise of resurrection was not just for her, but for everyone. She was, as they said, the first to cross the bridge that her son had built. St. John of Damascus, preaching in the 8th century, said, "Today the holy and animated ark of the living God, which had contained her own Maker, rests in the temple of God not made by hands. She is transferred to heaven and angels rejoice." But beyond the theology and poetry lies something deeply human, a truth anyone who has ever loved and lost can feel. The Dormition tells us that death for the faithful is not destruction but reunion. That love does not end when the heart stops beating. That even the quietest life can ripple through eternity. In this, Mary becomes not a distant queen but a mirror for every believer. Her story is not about privilege but promise. The same grace that lifted her will in time lift us all. Yet the mystery retains its veil. Historians debate dates and places. Theologians discuss symbolism and doctrine. But for those who stand in candlelit churches on the feast of the Dormition, surrounded by hymns that shimmer like ancient stars, the question is not did it happen, but what does it mean for us? It means that flesh can be holy, that mortality can be transfigured, that heaven once thought unreachable has already opened its door to one of our own. Perhaps that is why the early church never placed this story in the canon. To write it down would have been to limit it, to enclose what was meant to remain infinite. The Dormition was not a story for the page but for the heart, a living icon that speaks each time a believer whispers her name. And so the Mother of God sleeps not in tomb or legend, but in glory. The angels still gather. The Ja'ilnana fragrance of lilies still fills the air. And across centuries, across languages and continents, her children still sing the same refrain. Rejoice, O Queen, for you have passed from death to life. You who carried the eternal word now dwell among the eternal. What began as a whispered tale in hidden circles became one of the Church's most luminous mysteries. A mystery that says death is not a wall, but a window. That even the grave, when filled with faith, becomes a doorway through which light pours endlessly. As we move deeper into this story, that light will only grow brighter. For where the Dormition ends, another revelation begins. The discovery of a tomb that should have held her body but did not. A silence that speaks louder than all the words ever written. The story of the Dormition lingers in the heart like incense after prayer. A fragrance that refuses to fade. The apostles had watched the light rise from her body, had laid her in a tomb, had sung until dawn, and had seen the earth itself glow with peace. But when they returned days later, the tomb was empty. And from that silence grew the great question that has divided scholars and pilgrims for nearly 2,000 years. Where on this earth did the Mother of God finally rest? 2 cities, 2 shrines, 2 stories, both claiming to hold the memory of her last breath, both marked by miracles, both revered across centuries. One in the east, one in the west. Jerusalem and Ephesus, the valley of Jehoshaphat and the hill of nightingales. One tomb blessed by Byzantine emperors, another protected by humble villagers and later by Muslim caretakers who guarded it as sacred. Could both be true? Could the woman who carried eternity in her womb have been honored in 2 places because heaven itself refused to leave her story confined to one? The earliest tradition, and perhaps the oldest, lies in Jerusalem, the city of her beginnings, the city of her grief, the city where her son's blood once darkened the stones. Near the foot of the Mount of Olives, across the narrow Kidron Valley, stands a church half buried in earth. Its steps descend deep into rock, cool and dark, echoing with prayers in a dozen languages. Pilgrims call it the Tomb of the Virgin. The air there is thick with centuries of devotion. Candles flicker before the stone chamber said to have once held her body. Incense coils upward like breath. Even before the great schisms and councils, Christian pilgrims came here to kneel in silence, to touch the rough walls, to whisper petitions to the mother who was no longer seen but always near. By the 4th century, this place was already revered. The Byzantine Emperor Theodosius built a basilica nearby called the Church of the Kathisma. To honor her repose, when it was destroyed, another rose in its place. Crusaders later carved their marks into the pillars, Armenians painted their icons upon the walls, and even Muslims came to pay their respects to Maryam, revered in the Quran as the purest of women. Yet those who guarded the tomb all agreed on one strange truth. It was empty. From the earliest records, no relics were found there, no bones, no fragments of clothing. Only the legend that, after 3 days, the stone was rolled back to reveal nothing but light. Meanwhile, far to the west, another story took root. One less imperial, more tender, passed down through whispers and dreams. In the hills above the ancient city of Ephesus, where John the Apostle once preached, there lies a small stone dwelling surrounded by cypress and olive trees. Locals call it Mariam Anna Avi, the house of the Mother Mary. The first hint of this place comes from an unlikely source, the visions of a 19th century German nun, Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich. Bedridden and blind, she described in detail a small house in a distant land where the Virgin had lived out her final years. She spoke of its stone walls, its shape, even the direction of its doorway. Her words, written down by a priest, might have been forgotten, except that decades later French missionaries followed her descriptions to a remote hillside in modern-day Turkey. And there, exactly where she had said, they found the ruins of a one-room structure built of ancient stones facing west toward the setting sun. Nearby flowed a spring whose water, locals said, healed the sick. The villagers, most of them Muslim, told the priests that for generations their ancestors had climbed the hill each year on August 15th to honor the holy woman who rose to heaven. They did not know her Christian name. They called her Mariam Anna, Mother Mary. Archaeologists examined the site and dated parts of the foundation to the 1st century. Later additions matched Byzantine modifications from centuries after. Pilgrims began to visit and miracles were reported, the lame walking, the blind seeing, the barren conceiving. In time, the Vatican quietly acknowledged the site as a place worthy of veneration. 2 tombs, one empty, one never meant to be filled. In Jerusalem, her absence was proof of glory. In Ephesus, her presence was peace itself. The question of which is true has fueled debate for centuries. Historians point to Jerusalem, citing early records from the 2nd and 3rd centuries that mention her repose near the Mount of Olives. The Orthodox liturgies, the ancient Apocrypha, and even the earliest Marian feasts were rooted in the Holy Land. For the Byzantines, the Valley of Jehoshaphat was the sacred threshold between heaven and earth. The Valley of Final Judgment, where prophets said the dead would rise. To place her there was to say that she already lived the resurrection promised to all. But others look to Ephesus with equal conviction. They note that John, to whom Christ entrusted his mother, is never recorded returning to Jerusalem after the crucifixion. Instead, he made his mission in Asia Minor, guiding the fledgling churches of the region. The Book of Revelation, written by John, names Ephesus as one of the 7 churches of divine message. Would he have left Mary, his charge, behind in Jerusalem amid persecution and revolt? The evidence from both places runs deep, yet neither can claim final victory. Each tells a truth of its own kind. Perhaps she lived in Ephesus and her body was later taken to Jerusalem for burial. Or perhaps her tomb in Jerusalem was built not as a grave, but as a shrine, an empty symbol of what could not be contained. When Byzantine emperors built great cathedrals in her honor, they did not choose between the two. They sent gifts to both. Pilgrims visited both. Even Islamic caliphs, centuries later, offered funds for the upkeep of the Jerusalem shrine, recognizing Mary as one untouched by sin and beloved by God. In both sites, the boundary between Christian and Muslim reverence blurs. The Quran calls her Maryam bint Imran, chosen above all women. Muslim women still come to her house in Ephesus, tying ribbons to trees, praying for children, for peace, for healing. The same prayers echo from Christian mouths, separated by creed but united in longing. And so the two tombs stand like two mirrors facing one another, each reflecting the other's light, each incomplete without the other. One speaks of departure, the other of dwelling. One lies in the heart of the Holy Land, the other on the edge of the Aegean Sea, both pulsing with the same quiet heartbeat of faith. Perhaps the answer is not in geography but in theology. Perhaps both are true because the truth they tell is not bound to soil or stone. The mystery of the Virgin's end is not a riddle to be solved, but a revelation to be pondered. In life she had held within her the uncontainable. Why should her resting place be any less mysterious? The ancient fathers spoke often of paradox, the idea that divine truths resist simple answers. Mary's two tombs may be the holiest paradox of all. Two places touched by the same presence, each carrying a fragment of the story heaven chose to scatter like seeds. Imagine the pilgrims who came in those early centuries, walking barefoot along dusty roads under the glare of eastern sun. Some journeyed to the Kidron Valley, climbing down into the cool chambers where monks sang hymns in the dim light. Others crossed seas and mountains to the Ephesian hills, where wind moved through olive branches like a whisper of wings. Both groups knelt, wept, prayed, and left believing they had touched something eternal. In both places they told of strange occurrences, light appearing where no lamp burned, the scent of roses in winter, oil seeping from stones said to bear her imprint. In both they felt the same inexplicable calm, the sense that the distance between heaven and earth had narrowed to a breath. Perhaps that is what Mary's legacy has always been, to close the distance, to draw the infinite near. Modern archaeologists continue to study the two sites with scientific precision. Carbon dating stones, analyzing soil layers, tracing ancient pilgrimage routes. Yet for every layer they uncover, another mystery appears. The more the earth yields its secrets, the deeper the silence becomes. The historian may demand evidence, but the believer hears something greater. A story written not in ink, but in light. A story that refuses to fit within the boundaries of reason because it was never meant to. It is fitting, perhaps, that her earthly end remains unresolved. For Mary's life itself was an answer to paradox. Virgin and mother, mortal and vessel of the eternal silent, yet shaping the course of salvation. If she had a single tomb, a single address, she might have become a relic of one place. Instead, she became the memory of all places, the mother of the world. Standing in either shrine today, one can feel the same pulse. In Jerusalem, the candles cast trembling halos across the stone. In Ephesus, the wind carries the scent of myrtle and wild thyme. Each holds a fragment of her story. Not as contradiction, but as completion. The tombs are not rivals, they are echoes. And maybe, in the end, that is heaven's way of reminding us that what is holy cannot be contained by borders, by language, by creed. The one who once carried the divine now carries all of us, across nations, across time, across the endless divide between what we can prove and what we can only feel. Perhaps both tombs are true, or perhaps neither is. Perhaps her true resting place is where the faithful gather to remember her. In every whispered prayer, every candle lit, every act of mercy done in her name. For the woman who bore heaven was never meant to belong to earth alone. And so the question remains unanswered. And maybe that is the answer itself. because mystery, like love, does not need resolution. It only needs reverence. The pilgrim's footsteps fade into silence, the olive branches sway, and somewhere beyond both Jerusalem and Ephesus, the Mother of God smiles, not from one tomb or another, but from the place where both roads meet, the heart of heaven. And it is from that radiant uncertainty that the next part of her story emerges, not from earth at all, but from the realm of vision, where angels and mortals meet, and the impossible becomes light. The mystery of the two tombs lingers like twilight, half shadow, half radiance, both empty, both filled with the same quiet reverence that whispers of something the world was never meant to explain. Yet across that same silence comes another story, one older than the shrines, older than the stone. It lives in the fragile manuscripts of the early centuries, in words copied by trembling hands, passed from monastery to monastery, until time itself blurred the line between legend and revelation. They called it the Transitus Mariae, the passing of Mary. To the early faithful, it was more than a tale. It was testimony. It described not what men imagined, but what the apostles themselves were said to have witnessed. The final moments of the woman who had given her flesh to eternity. And though the Church never placed it within the canon of Scripture, the faithful cherished it like a secret sung in the dark. The text begins with light. Mary, sensing her hour drawing near, prayed in silence. The wind outside her home stilled, even the birds grew quiet. Then suddenly an angel appeared, not as a figure of fire or judgment, but as a messenger clothed in softness and calm. In his hand he carried a palm branch brighter than emerald, its leaves shimmering with unearthly light. "Rejoice," the angel said, "for your time has come. Your son awaits you in glory." Mary bowed her head, the same humble gesture that had changed history once before. She took the branch and kissed it, and with that touch her heart filled with peace. She sent word to the apostles, though they were scattered across continents and seas. And then something wondrous happened, the same miracle the ancient texts describe again and again. The apostles were gathered from every corner of the earth. Peter was said to be in Rome, preaching to crowds when the sky darkened and a beam of light encircled him. John was in Ephesus, his hands raised in prayer when a voice called his name. Andrew, Thomas, and the rest. Each felt a sudden trembling beneath their feet, a warmth like fire upon their faces. The world turned as if heaven itself was drawing them together, pulling them through time and distance toward one quiet home. When they arrived, they found her waiting. The house glowed with a radiance that did not come from candle or flame. Mary lay upon a simple bed, her face calm, her hands folded. Around her the air shimmered like water. Some said they heard music, faint but unearthly, as though creation itself was singing a lullaby. The apostles fell to their knees. Peter wept. John held her hand, and she smiled at them. That same quiet smile that had once comforted her child beneath the shadow of the cross. The ancient text says that in that moment the heavens opened. A light brighter than the sun filled the room. From it descended her Son, the Christ, radiant and glorious, surrounded by angels. He came not as judge, but as child returning for his mother. He spoke her name, not as woman as he had once said from the cross, but with the tenderness of a son saying, "Mother." "Come," he said, "your labor is ended." And with those words she breathed one last time. Her soul rose from her body like fragrance rising from burning myrrh. Christ received her into his arms, not as God receiving dust, but as a son carrying the mother who had once carried him. The apostles, trembling, began to sing. They lifted her body gently, wrapped it in white linen, and placed it upon a bier. Peter led the procession, carrying the angel's palm branch as a symbol of victory over death. The people of Jerusalem followed, and it was said that even the trees bowed as they passed. When they reached the Mount of Olives, they laid her body in a tomb cut from the rock, the same place where the prophets had once spoken of the coming resurrection. They sealed it with stone, and there they kept vigil for 3 days. But the story does not end with mourning. On the 3rd day, Thomas arrived, always the late one, always the doubter. He had been preaching in a distant land when he saw a vision in the sky. Angels ascending with a radiant woman clothed in light. He fell to his knees, crying out, "Mother, remember me." And the vision answered, "Come, my son." When he reached Jerusalem, the apostles embraced him with tears. But when he asked to see her one last time, they hesitated. The tomb was sealed. Her rest was sacred. Yet Thomas wept, begging for a final farewell. At last Peter agreed. Together they rolled the stone aside. What they saw left them speechless. The tomb was empty. No body, no bones, no shroud, only the scent of lilies and the angel's palm branch now blooming with flowers. The earth where her body had lain was warm and fragrant as if touched by heaven's breath. Thomas fell to his knees once more, but this time there was no doubt in him, only awe. He lifted the flowers from the tomb, and as he did, he heard her voice carried on the wind. "Why do you seek me among the dead? I am not here." The apostles understood. What they had witnessed was not death, but transformation. The one who had first given flesh to divinity had now been given divinity in flesh. She had fallen asleep in peace and awakened in glory. The symbolism was clear even to them. The empty tomb, the 3rd day, the presence of flowers and fragrance, echoes of her son's resurrection, repeating in her life the same victory over decay. She was not merely following Christ, she was embodying his promise, proving that what was born of heaven could never truly perish. The ancient homilies tell that the apostles returned from the tomb singing hymns of praise. Their sorrow had turned to wonder, and from that wonder grew the tradition that would one day become the feast of the Dormition, and later, the Assumption. In one Syriac manuscript, the story ends with these words, "And the Lord said, As I took Enoch and Elijah before corruption touched them, so now I take my mother, that her body may not see decay. For she is the pure vessel that bore the word, and the earth is not worthy to contain her." It was not an ending, but a beginning, a vision meant to remind every believer that death is not exile, but return. To this day, the account of the apostles' gathering stands at the heart of the Eastern tradition. In every icon of the Dormition, they are painted around her bier. Each face distinct, each posture humble. Above them, Christ holds a small, glowing child wrapped in white. That child, say the theologians, is her soul. The Son once received into her arms now receives her into his. It is more than art. It is theology made visible. The apostles' vision is a mirror of all that Christianity teaches about life and death. It is the resurrection told again, this time through the mother who shared her son's sorrow and now shares his triumph. The empty tomb is not proof of absence, but proof of promise. Even the detail of Thomas arriving late carries meaning. In the Gospel, he was the last to believe in Christ's resurrection until he saw the wounds with his own eyes. In the tradition of Mary's passing, he is once again the last to arrive. But this time, he does not need to see wounds to believe. He opens a tomb and finds not a body but flowers. Faith has ripened into vision. Some call the story symbolic, others poetic, but for those who have walked through grief, it rings with truth. It says that love does not vanish when the body does. It says that death cannot silence what was born in holiness. It says that where sorrow ends, beauty begins. In Jerusalem, pilgrims still kneel in the tomb of the Virgin and press their faces to the cold stone, whispering prayers into the silence. In Ephesus, candles burn beside a simple house on a hill, and the wind carries the scent of myrtle through the open door. Two places, one mystery. But above them both, this vision hovers like a star that refuses to fade. The apostles' story is more than memory. It is message. They saw light descend. They saw love lifted up. They saw heaven open for the one who once opened it for all humanity. And perhaps that is why her story continues to echo through time. Because the apostles' vision is not just about what they saw, but what we are meant to see through them. That death is not an ending. That every loss, if carried in faith, becomes a seed of resurrection. That the tombs we fear may one day bloom with flowers of their own. In the centuries that followed, theologians would argue over history, evidence, and symbolism. But the early church did not debate, it adored. The apostles' witness was enough. The woman who bore God had been taken into light. Her body was nowhere because her presence was everywhere. And when night falls over those sacred hills, over Jerusalem's valley, over Ephesus's mountains, the air still hums with that ancient story. A mother's passing, a son's embrace, a tomb full of flowers. The apostles saw it, and through their eyes, so do we. But the story does not rest there. Because once the vision fades, what remains is the silence of the tomb. The silence that demands an answer. The apostles' witness had revealed the miracle. Now the question remains, what became of the body that vanished? And why did the church guard its absence for so long? The story of the apostles' vision ends in light, a radiance so pure it feels eternal. Yet what lingers afterward is silence. A silence that hums, alive and trembling, like the still air after thunder. For 3 days, that silence lay over the tomb in the valley of Jehoshaphat. The apostles had buried the Mother of God with prayers and tears, sealing the rock with reverence. They stood vigil beneath the olive trees, their hearts heavy yet calm, believing her rest was final. But on the 3rd day they returned. Perhaps it was grief that drew them back, or faith, or something deeper. A quiet urging of the Spirit that told them this story was not yet finished. When they rolled away the stone, the light that poured out was not of this world. The air inside shimmered with fragrance, not the stench of decay, but the perfume of life itself. Roses, myrrh, and a sweetness no mortal tongue could name. Her body was gone. The shroud lay folded neatly upon the stone, the palm branch still green beside it. The apostles fell to their knees. Some cried aloud in joy, others trembled in fear. John whispered that he had seen this before. An empty tomb, linen folded, the scent of divine presence lingering in the air. Peter covered his face and wept, for he knew. He had seen resurrection once, and now he saw it again, not by power stolen from death, but by love fulfilled in peace. Thomas, still clutching the flowers he had found blooming upon the bier, raised them toward heaven. "She is not here," he said softly. "Her son has taken her." The others said nothing. They could not. How could they explain what they saw? How could they speak of a death without decay, of a tomb that glowed with light instead of shadow? Even in a faith built on miracles, this one defied language. The earliest records from the 5th and 6th centuries echo their awe in a single haunting phrase. Her body was not found, not destroyed, not hidden, not stolen, simply not there. And from that absence grew theology. It began as whispers among the faithful, spreading through the East, then westward across the ancient world. Preachers in Constantinople and Antioch began to speak of Mary's translation, that she had been taken into heaven, body and soul. In Egypt, monks painted her in icons rising amid clouds, her hands lifted toward her son. In Syria, poets sang of the Virgin clothed in the sun, adorned with stars, borne upward by angels who wept for joy. Yet for centuries the Church said nothing officially. The story lived in hymns, in liturgy, in the hearts of believers, but never in doctrine. Why? Why did the Church, so quick to define mysteries of faith, remain silent about the one miracle that crowned the life of Christ's own mother? The answer lies partly in the nature of mystery itself. The early Church knew that some truths were too sacred to dissect. The resurrection of her Son was proclaimed to all nations. Her assumption into heaven was whispered only to those who already believed. To define it too soon, to make it law, would have been to cage what was meant to remain holy. The faithful did not need proof. They had peace. Still, the silence was not indifference. It was reverence. The Church Fathers wrote carefully, choosing words like dormition, translation, glorification. They spoke not of spectacle, but of quiet fulfillment, the natural consequence of a life completely yielded to God. St. John of Damascus, writing in the 8th century, dared to put into words what others feared to say. Her body did not remain in the tomb. She was raised by him who had taken flesh from her. He compared her to the Ark of the Covenant, too sacred for corruption, too pure for the grave. The analogy was perfect. In the Old Testament, the Ark had once held the Word of God in stone. Mary had carried the Word made flesh. When the temple fell, the Ark vanished. When the world's Redeemer rose, his living Ark vanished too. And so absence became the evidence. For every other saint, the Church preserved relics, bones, fragments, garments, tokens of mortality. But for her there were none. No bones displayed, no fragments venerated. The greatest treasure of Christendom left no trace. By the time the 5th century arrived, the belief had taken firm root. Bishops in both East and West began to preach the miracle openly. In the homilies of the Dormition, they spoke of how creation itself rejoiced as her body was lifted beyond the stars. Theologians called it fitting, not a reward, but a consequence of grace. She who had carried life itself could not see corruption. Still, the Church held back from declaration. It was as if heaven and earth had made a silent pact. The truth would live through faith, not decree. Generations passed, empires fell, languages changed, but the story remained the same. Wherever Christianity spread, from the sands of Egypt to the forests of Gaul, the faithful told the same tale. The Mother of God was gone, but not dead. She had been taken where her Son had gone before her. And in every telling, the tomb remained empty. Archaeologists would one day descend into the ancient crypt of Jerusalem, tracing the outlines of the early basilica built around her resting place. They found inscriptions left by pilgrims as early as the 4th century, prayers etched into the stone, pleas for mercy, thanksgiving for healing, invocations of the Mother of the living. But no relics, no remains, only silence and the lingering scent of incense that seemed older than the stones themselves. The absence became more than mystery. It became message. It said that holiness is not confined to decay, that flesh itself can be transfigured. It said that the divine plan of salvation was not a story of escape from the body, but of the body's redemption. In her, the promise of resurrection was no longer abstract. It was flesh and blood, taken up into light. For those who struggled to believe in life beyond death, the empty tomb of Mary was proof written not in argument, but in love. The Mother had followed the Son, not as deity, not as myth, but as the first of humanity made whole. Still, scholars would question, skeptics would wonder, why wait so long? Why did the Church not define her assumption until nearly 2,000 years later? The truth is both simple and profound. The Church did not invent the belief. It merely recognized what had always been held. Like a seed buried deep in soil, the doctrine grew quietly through centuries of faith and devotion, watered by song and prayer until the time was right for it to bloom. That time came in the year 1950 when Pope Pius XII, after consultation with bishops from around the world, declared the Assumption of Mary a dogma of the Catholic faith. But he did not base his proclamation on new discovery, nor on archaeological proof. He based it on what the faithful had never ceased to know, that her body was not found because heaven had claimed it. When he spoke the words, Munificentissimus Deus, defining the Assumption as revealed truth, the world did not hear a new teaching. It heard the echo of ancient hymns sung in the catacombs, the voices of monks chanting in desert chapels, the whispers of mothers teaching their children to pray. It heard the apostles standing before an empty tomb, breathing in the scent of roses and myrrh, unable to explain, unwilling to doubt. The church had not created a mystery. It had finally given that mystery a name, and so, what began as silence became song. What began as absence became assurance. In that moment, the story of the Virgin's empty tomb came full circle, from vision to faith, from faith to proclamation. The same God who had raised his Son had raised his servant. The same light that had rolled away one stone had rolled away another. The ancient texts, once dismissed as poetry, now read like prophecy. Her body was not found, they said, and they were right. For it had been lifted beyond the reach of time. Even now the two tombs, Jerusalem's and Ephesus's, remain empty. Candles still burn, pilgrims still come, and the air still carries that strange sweetness no scholar can name. Perhaps that is the real meaning of her story. Not proof, not definition, but hope. Because if the Mother of God could be taken from death to life, then the same destiny waits for all who follow the path she walked. Humility, surrender, love. The apostles did not understand it fully, we still do not. But standing before that empty tomb, surrounded by light and fragrance, they understood enough. That death is not a wall but a doorway, and that beyond it stands the one who first opened heaven's gates. The flowers they found there have long since turned to dust, yet their scent remains. It clings to history, to faith, to every heart that still believes. And somewhere beyond the veil, the woman who bore the eternal word still breathes, still prays, still waits. Not as a memory, but as a promise kept. For the tomb was empty not because she was gone, but because she had arrived. The empty tomb glowed with the soft light of mystery, and yet the centuries that followed it glowed not with proclamation, but with silence. It was as though the miracle itself had whispered to the world, "Be still." The apostles had seen what they could not explain, and the early church, filled with awe, chose not to shout what heaven had chosen to hide. In the East, the story of Mary's dormition and her being taken into glory became part of liturgy, song, and sacred art. Churches rose in her name, hymns resounded through candlelit halls, and believers celebrated her translation into heaven each year with lilies and incense. But in the West, in Rome, the silence endured. It was not the silence of disbelief. It was the silence of guardianship. For hundreds of years, the Western Church said nothing definitive. Its greatest voices, Augustine, Jerome, Ambrose, spoke her name with reverence but also restraint. They praised her faith, her obedience, her motherhood of God, yet stopped just short of describing what happened when her earthly life ended. Their words were careful, shaped by both awe and caution, as if they feared that too much certainty might fracture something sacred. Augustine, who wrote volumes on grace and resurrection, never denied her glory, but he left her final destiny to divine mystery. Jerome, who translated the scriptures into Latin and lived for years in Bethlehem, honored her purity yet said little of her departure. It was as though they stood at the threshold of revelation and chose not to cross. Why? Why would the Western Church, so passionate in its defense of the faith, remain so reserved about the fate of the woman who bore the Word made flesh? Why did they allow the East to sing her triumph while the West kept her story half-veiled in shadow? Perhaps they feared misunderstanding. In the early centuries, heresies abounded. Gnostics who claimed divine beings were trapped in mortal flesh. Pagans who turned mortals into gods. The Church had fought long and hard to affirm that only one had ascended by his own power, Christ alone. To speak too freely of Mary's assumption risked confusion. She was not divine. She was human. To exalt her too quickly might lead others to mistake her veneration for worship. And so Rome guarded the story in silence, not to diminish her, but to protect her. Instead of declaration, the belief lived quietly through liturgy. By the 5th century, local feasts in honor of Mary's Dormition were already spreading across the West. The faithful gathered each year around mid-August, not to mourn, but to celebrate the woman who had borne life itself. They sang of her rest, her peace, her being taken beyond the reach of sorrow. And though no official decree explained it, everyone knew what the hymns implied. It was a truth whispered in prayer, not proclaimed from pulpits. The West, ever cautious with mystery, preferred the language of devotion to the language of doctrine. Sculptors carved her in stone rising above the clouds. Artists painted her surrounded by angels. But theologians wrote of her in metaphors. They spoke of the Ark of the New Covenant, of the woman clothed with the sun, of the bride prepared for the heavenly city. Their words glowed with meaning, but they left the miracle itself unspoken. In this restraint, the silence became a kind of reverence. The Church did not deny what heaven had done, it simply chose not to dissect it. Behind that decision, scholars today see a deeper wisdom. The early Western theologians were heirs to the Roman mind, disciplined, structured, wary of unverified visions. They understood that truth could be profaned by haste. Just as the Israelites covered the ark with a veil, so too the Church veiled the mystery of Mary's end, waiting until faith itself matured enough to receive it. Augustine once wrote, "We know not where the Lord laid her, but we know she sleeps in peace." His words carry both humility and quiet faith. He does not say she died. He does not say she was assumed. He simply trusts that whatever happened to her body was an act of divine mercy. For centuries, this was the Roman way, to believe without explanation. But that does not mean the story was forgotten. It lived in the hearts of the faithful, in monasteries and cathedrals, in the quiet rituals of mid-August when bells rang softly and candles flickered before her image. It lived in the poetry of the mystics who saw her as the bridge between heaven and earth, the first to follow her Son into glory. By the 7th century, the feast of her Dormition had been adopted in Rome itself, renamed the Assumptio Beatae Mariae Virginis, the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Yet even then, no decree defined what the faithful celebrated. The liturgy spoke of joy, of her being taken into the heavenly court, but the magisterium remained silent. It was a mystery kept alive by faith alone. The silence of Rome lasted through the rise and fall of empires, through the Crusades, through the building of basilicas and the burning of libraries. It endured through centuries of theology and reform, through schism and renewal. And through it all, Mary's story remained untouched, like a pearl hidden deep within the folds of time, gleaming softly but never fully revealed. There is a kind of paradox in that silence. In an age when the Church defended the smallest nuances of doctrine, when councils argued fiercely over every phrase of creed, the fate of Mary was left unargued, unchallenged. It was not forgotten, so that it was protected. As though the divine had placed its hand over that secret and said, "Not yet." This restraint gave rise to something beautiful, a faith that did not depend on explanation. Generations of believers prayed to her not because the church told them she was in heaven, but because they already knew she must be. The same intuition that led the apostles to believe the tomb's emptiness meant glory now stirred in the hearts of countless Christians. Painters captured what words could not. Giotto's frescoes showed her rising through the blue of heaven, her hands open, her face serene. Fra Angelico painted her among roses, her garments rippling with divine wind. Cathedrals filled their ceilings with her ascent, angels lifting her toward light. In every brushstroke, the silent doctrine spoke louder than any sermon. It was art that became theology, and devotion that became doctrine in waiting. Even when reformers centuries later challenged the authority of Rome, even when wars and plagues shattered Christendom's unity, her story endured. It was not a matter of command, but of conviction, something that lived in the bones of the faithful. To speak her story too plainly would have risked reducing it to theory. To keep it unspoken allowed it to breathe. Modern historians looking back call it prudence. Mystics call it wisdom. Perhaps it was both. For the truths that matter most are often the ones that cannot survive dissection, only contemplation. The silence of Rome was not emptiness, it was incubation. When Augustine and Jerome wrote their cautious words, when popes offered no dogmatic answers, when theologians left her story unwritten, something profound was happening beneath that stillness. The belief was ripening. The people's devotion, their prayers, their feast days, all of it was shaping the heart of the church from below until the day would come when heaven's whisper could finally become a proclamation. Until then, the silence protected her. And in that silence, her presence deepened. She became the quiet mother of a noisy world, the listening heart of a faith still learning how to love. Her image stood in chapels and cottages, in palaces and prisons, carrying the same message her silence carried. That holiness does not always need to speak to be heard. The centuries would eventually break that silence, but not yet. First, the world would need to remember what silence feels like. The kind that is not absence, but awe. Because behind Rome's silence was not doubt. It was reverence for a revelation so delicate that even the church itself hesitated to touch it too soon. They believed heaven had revealed something only to a few. To the apostles who saw the empty tomb, to the faithful who dreamed of roses in winter, to the saints who heard her voice in prayer. That was enough. And so the story waited, like a candle unlit, like a song half remembered, like a secret guarded between heaven and earth. When the time was right, the church would speak. But for now, the silence endured. And in that silence, belief took root deeper than words ever could. It was a silence not of forgetting, but of faith. The kind of silence that holds its breath because it knows that what comes next will change the world. And what came next was precisely that. The awakening of the hidden stories, the rediscovery of ancient texts, and the quiet uprising of devotion that turned mystery into movement. The hush of Rome would not last forever. It was the pause before the dawn, the sacred stillness before the bells of heaven began to ring again. The silence of Rome had stretched like a veil across centuries, soft but unbroken. A reverent pause between revelation and remembrance. Yet even while the official voice of the church remained quiet, the world beneath that silence stirred. In hidden monasteries and desert caves among scribes who worked by candlelight, new whispers began to surface. Stories too radiant to vanish, too daring to be spoken aloud. They were the forbidden books, the hidden gospels of Mary's final mystery. These were not the writings of the canon, but of devotion. The voices of believers who could not forget what the tomb refused to contain. They were copied in secret, cherished in fragments, smuggled through centuries like embers carried in the folds of faith. Their names survived in silence. The Book of the Dormition of Mary, the Liber Requiae Mariae, the Transitus Beatae Virginis, each claimed to preserve what the apostles had seen when heaven came for the Mother of God. To read them is to step into the borderland between history and vision. The pages shimmer with images that belong neither wholly to earth nor to heaven. Angels singing at the edge of the world, the stars dimming as her soul departed, the sun halting in the sky as though creation itself bowed in mourning. These were not the inventions of idle mystics. They were the attempts of early Christians to describe the indescribable, what it looked like when holiness left the world. In the Book of the Dormition of Mary, the story begins in twilight. Mary, sensing her time drawing near, withdraws to her chamber to pray. The air grows heavy, the light thick with gold. Then the voice of her Son calls out to her from beyond sight. "Come, my beloved, my dove, my undefiled one, the time has come. Rise and enter the joy prepared for you." At those words, the ground trembles. The trees outside bow their branches. The sea grows still. The text says that when her spirit left her body, all of creation felt it. The same creation that had rejoiced when she first said yes to God now paused in reverent sorrow as she said yes again, this time to eternity. The heavens were not silent. Choirs of angels filled the air with music that had no melody, only light. Even the stars, they wrote, blinked as if weeping. In the Liber Requiae Mariae, the Book of Mary's Rest, the imagery grows even more astonishing. It tells of the apostles gathered by divine will, standing before her bier when a great radiance filled the room. The Lord himself appeared, surrounded by an army of angels dressed in white fire. He blessed her body, and it rose slightly from the bier, weightless, untouched by corruption. And as he lifted her soul, the entire cosmos seemed to echo with his words. What is born of purity cannot see decay. For those who read these texts in the early centuries, this was not mere poetry. It was theology written in wonder. They saw in Mary not simply the mother of Jesus, but the living symbol of redeemed humanity. In her, they said, the curse of Adam was reversed. She who gave flesh to the divine could not return to dust. Her body had been the first sanctuary of the incarnate Word. Therefore, it would not know the corruption of death. The miracle was not just for her. It was a promise of what would one day come for all who were made holy in Christ. But the Church, careful and cautious, kept these writings at the edges of its libraries. The Gnostic heresies were spreading, weaving strange myths that blended heaven and earth without distinction. The bishops feared that the apocryphal stories of Mary might be twisted into superstition or used to confuse the faithful. And so, quietly, these texts were banned, their public reading forbidden, their circulation condemned. Yet banning could not erase them. Monks in the deserts of Egypt and Syria copied them by hand, their styluses cutting faint grooves into parchment that would outlast empires. In dim cells, Coptic scribes painted the letters with red ink for divine speech, black for human sorrow, gold for the presence of angels. In the monasteries of Mesopotamia, Syriac fragments were hidden in earthen jars, discovered centuries later by scholars who could still smell the smoke of ancient incense in the folds of the scrolls. Greek copies appeared in the libraries of Mount Athos, preserved by hermits who treated the stories as sacred relics. Each language told the same truth in its own rhythm, that the woman who bore the divine could not see corruption, that death itself yielded before her purity. Some versions of the Dormition describe cosmic signs too strange to dismiss as metaphor. One tells of the Jordan River reversing its flow on the day of her passing. Another says that as her soul rose, flowers bloomed across the Mount of Olives in a single instant. Blossoms that never withered, glowing faintly in moonlight. To the modern reader, these may sound like legend, But to the ancient believer they were revelation, not events measured by reason, but symbols of creation rejoicing at redemption completed. Even the trembling of the earth, the darkening of the stars, and the bursting of flowers carried meaning. The world had groaned when Eve fell. Now it sang as Mary rose. In some fragments, the apostles themselves described the awe that seized them as they watched the heavens open. Peter wept, saying, "Blessed are we who have seen the glory that no words can tell." John, her adopted son, wrote, "The fragrance of her departure filled the house, and we were not afraid, for the scent was peace." These are not the voices of poets, they are the voices of witnesses, or of those who believed themselves to be echoing the witnesses of old. Over time, the hidden books began to shape Christian imagination, more deeply than official doctrine ever could. The liturgies of the East borrowed their imagery. Painters used their visions to fill the walls of churches with scenes of her departure. The apostles gathered in grief, Christ descending in light, angels carrying her soul like a child wrapped in white. The people sang the hymns drawn from these writings long before scholars could decide whether they were apocrypha or inspiration. Even the Western silence began to hum with their influence. Monks in Rome, though forbidden to read such texts openly, quoted their lines in private prayers. The great feast of the Assumption drew much of its imagery from their verses. Lilies in bloom, angels descending, the incorrupt body rising through clouds. Centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered fragments of the Liber Requiae Mariae in Coptic script, they found words that seemed to bridge the distance between myth and theology. She who carried the word cannot see decay, for her flesh was the dwelling of holiness. That single line, copied by hands long turned to dust, carried the heart of the belief that endured for 2,000 years. The texts themselves bear the scars of survival. Their parchment edges are burnt, their ink is faded by smoke and sand. Some pages are missing entirely, replaced by blank spaces where the meaning must be imagined. Yet even those absences feel holy, like the pauses between prayers, the silences that make words sacred. In their survival, one can sense the strange determination of the faithful. Empires fell, languages died, libraries burned, but the story lived on. Carried by memory, by devotion, by the stubborn love of those who believed that no truth revealed by heaven could ever truly vanish. It is in these forbidden pages that we glimpse a God of tenderness rather than triumph. The theology they reveal is not one of power, but of compassion. They paint a Christ who descends not as conqueror, but as son, who bends low to gather his mother in his arms, who crowns her not with authority, but with gentleness. In their language, heaven trembles not from wrath, but from wonder. The cosmos pauses not out of fear, but in reverence for a love so perfect that even decay bows before it. For the theologians who risked their reputations to preserve these texts, this vision mattered deeply. It told the world that divine power was not cold or distant, but intimate, that the God who made the stars also wept at a mother's passing. That holiness is not the absence of humanity, but its transfiguration. And so, across centuries, the hidden books whispered their truth to anyone willing to listen. They taught that the end of Mary's life was not about escape from the world, but about the world itself being lifted, the earth made capable of heaven. Their very survival feels like a parable, banned, condemned, and forgotten, yet still alive. Like the mystery they described. The woman who could not decay, the manuscripts that would not die. Even now, scholars continue to translate fragments newly found in deserts and monasteries. Each piece adds a brushstroke to the great unseen painting of her final moments. Angels like flames, stars bending in procession, the scent of paradise carried on wind. Perhaps that is why heaven allowed these stories to survive, not to replace Scripture, but to remind us that truth has many voices and some must speak from the shadows. The hidden books do not demand belief, they invite contemplation. They remind us that the sacred cannot always be confined to canon or creed. Sometimes the holiest stories are the ones whispered in secret, carried like contraband light through the long corridors of history. And in those whispers we hear it again, that gentle promise buried within every line. The woman who gave flesh to the divine could not see decay, because in her, flesh itself had already touched eternity. And through her, that eternity still reaches for us, calling us toward a glory too luminous to be bound by pages, borders, or even death itself. The hidden books had whispered of angels and light, of a woman taken beyond corruption, and of a creation trembling in awe. But what they truly revealed, beneath all their wonder and poetry, was not just the fate of one woman. It was the destiny of all humanity. For those early believers who gathered around candlelight to copy those forbidden words, Mary was not only the mother of God, she was the bridge between heaven and earth, the living sign of what humanity could become when touched completely by divine love. The miracle of her assumption, whether whispered in secret or painted in gold upon cathedral walls, was never meant to glorify her alone. It was a promise, a glimpse of the world restored, a vision of flesh and spirit reconciled at last. To the ancient church, the Assumption was not an ending. It was the completion of a journey that began the moment she said yes to the angel in Nazareth. From that first surrender, her life traced the path every soul must walk. From fear to faith, from sorrow to surrender, from mortality into the arms of eternity. Her story was the human story, redeemed and fulfilled. That is why early artists did not paint her as a goddess ascending by her own power. They painted her as woman, gentle, humble, hands open, face lifted in wonder as angels carry her through the breaking clouds. Her garments flowed like dawn light. Her eyes reflected the peace of one who no longer belongs to time. She rises not as queen of ambition, but as daughter of obedience. For them, she was not simply the mother of Christ. She was the first fruit of redemption. When early theologians looked upon her story, they saw in it the fulfillment of a divine pattern, that what began in her Son would also be completed in her. Christ's resurrection revealed the victory of God over death. Mary's Assumption revealed what that victory meant for humanity. He ascended by divine right. She was lifted by divine grace. One as creator, the other as creature, both united in glory. In her, they said, the fracture between heaven and earth was finally healed. The separation that began with the fall of Adam and Eve met its reversal in her flesh. Where Eve had once reached for forbidden knowledge, Mary reached for faith. Where the first woman's disobedience closed the gates of paradise, the obedience of the second opened them. The early church fathers spoke of this with trembling reverence. Saint Irenaeus wrote that the knot of Eve's disobedience was untied by the obedience of Mary. Later, Saint Ephrem the Syrian would describe her as the earth that bore heaven. And in her Assumption, they saw that metaphor made literal. Earth truly lifted into heaven. The theology that grew from this vision was not abstract philosophy. It was compassion given form. For in her, believers saw not only the holiness of God, but the tenderness of what it meant to be human. Mary's Assumption told them that salvation was not escape from the body, but its transformation. That matter itself, the clay from which we are made, could be glorified. The same flesh that aches, hungers, and suffers could one day shine with divine light. In her, heaven embraced earth completely, and that embrace was not fleeting. The Byzantine icons captured this truth with astonishing depth. In one, known simply as the Dormition, she lies upon a bier surrounded by the apostles. Her body rests in peace, but above her stands Christ, radiant, holding a small child clothed in white. That child, the painter said, was her soul, newly born into eternal life. The son who had once been cradled by his mother now cradles her. It is the circle of redemption, the reversal of grief. Western artists, centuries later, would turn this same mystery into the soaring beauty of the Assumption. The Virgin rising amid clouds, her arms open, angels swirling like wind, the earth below her bathed in golden light. But even in all that splendor, the message was the same. What happened to her was the future promised to us all. In her, heaven and earth no longer opposed each other. They met and embraced. This was not new theology to the early believers. It was woven into the very rhythm of their prayers. When they spoke of resurrection, they spoke of her. When they spoke of the kingdom of heaven, they thought of her face. She was proof that the divine plan was not a dream or metaphor. It had already begun. She was the living bridge, the evidence that God's promise could take flesh, could breathe, could rise. To those who lived under the shadow of persecution, this truth meant everything. The Romans could burn bodies, scatter ashes, silence voices, but if one human being had already been taken whole into heaven, then death itself had lost its dominion. Her story comforted mothers who buried their children, martyrs who faced lions in the arena, widows who watched their cities crumble. They could whisper her name in the darkness and remember. She had walked this same earth, wept the same tears, known the same pain. Yet she was now radiant beyond corruption. That belief that a woman of dust could now wear eternity became the heartbeat of Christian hope. It also transformed art into theology. Every painting, every hymn, every carved angel that lifted her skyward spoke to the same yearning written in every human heart: to be reunited body and soul with the source of all light. In the cathedrals of Europe, the story unfolded like scripture written in stone. Carved above doors, she rose surrounded by angels, her gaze turned heavenward. Beneath her, the faithful entered, stepping from shadow into light. Each time they looked up, they saw what they were destined to become. Not gods, not angels, but redeemed flesh. Her Assumption became the visual language of hope, a promise carved in marble, painted in gold, sung in psalms. For the philosophers and mystics, her story bridged another divide between reason and mystery. It offered an answer not through argument but through beauty. They saw that what the mind could not prove, the heart could still perceive. The world itself longed to be healed, and in her it was. She became, in the words of St. John Damascene, the living ladder by which earth climbs to heaven. The concept echoed through centuries of thought. In her Assumption, theologians saw humanity restored to its true dignity. They spoke of her as the prototype of the Church, the sign that what was begun in faith would one day be fulfilled in glory. Even the title Queen of Heaven, so often misunderstood, was not meant to make her divine, but to reveal the depth of God's generosity, that he would lift his servant to share in his victory, not as ruler over creation, but as its mother. The symbolism resonated across cultures. In Greek mosaics, she was crowned amid stars. In Coptic hymns, she was called the Bridge of Life. In Latin chants, she was praised as the gate that opens into light. Each image, each song was another way of saying the same thing. The distance between heaven and earth was no longer infinite. Through her, it had been crossed. And yet her story was not triumph alone. Every painting of her rising also carried the memory of her suffering. Behind every gold halo lay the shadow of the cross she once stood beneath. The same eyes that now gazed into heaven had once watched her son die in agony. The glory of her Assumption did not erase that pain, it transfigured it. That is why her ascent became not only symbol of hope, but of compassion. She was not distant or untouchable. She was the mother who had known grief and was now beyond it. Her victory was not over us, but for us. To the early church, she became the ultimate icon of divine mercy. Proof that sorrow could become sanctity, that the wounds of life could become gateways to grace. The flesh that once trembled beneath the cross now glowed with immortal light. And so, her Assumption was more than miracle. It was the theology of tenderness made visible. Every believer who looked at her image saw the truth of the creed they whispered each Sunday. I believe in the resurrection of the body and life everlasting. She was that creed made flesh, the first of many who would follow. In her, heaven had reached down not to erase humanity, but to complete it. The Assumption was not a break between heaven and earth. It was their reunion. It was the restoration of what had been lost in Eden, the healing of the rift that sin had torn. That is why her story endures, because it tells us something about ourselves. Every human longing for peace, for beauty, for home is already written into her rising. Every ache for meaning finds its answer in that image of a woman lifted through clouds, not by power, but by love. She is not a goddess beyond reach. She is us, the human made whole, the creature crowned by grace, the proof that God does not abandon his creation but brings it to fulfillment. In her, heaven and earth meet, not in myth, not in metaphor, but in mystery. And if her Assumption is a bridge, it is one built of faith itself, the same faith that began in a simple girl's yes and ends in eternal light. That bridge still stands, invisible yet enduring, stretching from the tombs of men to the throne of heaven, from sorrow to song. And across it, every prayer, every tear, every heartbeat of hope still travels upward, carried by the one who proved that love has the final word. The image of Mary rising through clouds, the bridge between heaven and earth, lingers like a vision that will not fade. For centuries, artists and believers alike gazed upon that mystery, sensing that her story did not end in human memory but continued into eternity itself. Yet for those who sought the deeper roots of her Assumption, the truth seemed written not only in the hidden books or whispered traditions, but in the pages of Scripture. Specifically in the final thundering visions of the Apocalypse. When St. John wrote the book of Revelation on the rocky island of Patmos, exiled and weary, his words poured out like fire. He spoke of beasts, plagues, thrones, and stars, of heaven opened and earth trembling. Yet within that vast cosmic vision, there is one image unlike any other, a woman clothed with the sun. She stands radiant, her garments woven from light, a crown of 12 stars upon her head. Beneath her feet the moon. Around her the heavens themselves seem to move in reverence. She is pregnant, crying out in labor as a dragon rises from the abyss to devour her child. But the child is caught up to God, and the woman is given wings to flee into the wilderness, where she is nourished and protected. To many, this was a vision of Israel, the chosen nation bringing forth the Messiah. But to the early church fathers, it was also more. It was Mary, the living ark of the covenant, the vessel through whom God entered creation. And perhaps it was also prophecy fulfilled. For what John saw on Patmos was not only a vision of the future, it was the echo of something he had already witnessed, the passing of the woman who had once been entrusted to his care. Tradition tells us that after the crucifixion, John took Mary into his home, fulfilling Christ's final command. Behold your mother. He lived with her, prayed with her, and watched as her earthly life drew to its quiet end. He alone among all the apostles would have seen what happened when her body was laid to rest and when, 3 days later, the tomb was found empty. Imagine him decades later, writing by lamplight, his eyes dimmed by age yet blazing with memory. The words of revelation flow from him like a vision, but somewhere beneath the symbolism there beats a personal heartbeat. The remembrance of the woman who had once looked upon the face of God as his mother. When he describes the ark appearing in heaven, then God's temple in heaven was opened, and the ark of his covenant was seen within his temple. The next verse does not show a golden chest of acacia wood, but the radiant woman clothed with the sun. To the ancient mind, this was no accident. The two were one and the same. For centuries, scholars have puzzled over the sudden shift in John's vision. Why would he mention the ark, the most sacred relic of Israel, and then immediately speak of a woman? Unless the two were connected. Unless the woman was the ark now revealed not on earth but in heaven. The parallel is profound. In the Old Testament, the ark had contained the stone tablets of the law, the manna from the wilderness, and Aaron's priestly rod, the symbols of God's covenant with his people. In Mary's womb, those symbols were fulfilled. She carried within her not law written on stone, but the living word. Not manna, but the bread of life. Not a priest's staff, but the high priest himself. The earthly ark had vanished centuries before, lost when the Babylonians destroyed the temple. But now, in John's vision, a new ark appears, not fashioned by human hands, but revealed in glory. It is not a box of gold, but a woman, radiant and alive. This was the insight that electrified the early theologians. Saint Epiphanius in the 4th century wrote, "The ark was a type of the Virgin, and the Virgin is truly the ark." Saint John Damascene later proclaimed, "Today the living ark of the living God, the one who carried her own maker, rests in the temple of the Lord, not made with hands." Their words suggest something breathtaking, that John's apocalypse may have been both prophecy and testimony, a revelation of heaven's future and a memory of what he had already seen. In her assumption, the woman became the sign in heaven. The glory he describes, the sun-clothed figure crowned with stars, is not mythic invention but the vision of Mary's transfiguration. The dragon's rage mirrors the cosmic enmity first declared in Genesis. "I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and hers." The child caught up to God reflects Christ's ascension. The woman preserved by God reflects Mary's assumption. In this way, Revelation chapter 12 becomes both cosmic history and personal memory. The story of salvation written in the heavens. The imagery of the 12 stars, too, carried layered meaning. To John, it symbolized Israel's 12 tribes, now fulfilled in the 12 apostles. The new covenant community that had sprung from her yes. To the later church, it represented the crown of eternal life, the glory bestowed upon one who had borne the King of Kings. Her being clothed with the sun spoke of divine radiance, not her own light, but the light of grace that enveloped her, as the first to share fully in her Son's resurrection. The moon beneath her feet symbolized the world of change and decay, subdued beneath her eternal constancy. These were not the images of an exalted goddess, but of humanity redeemed. She shone not because she was divine, but because she had reflected divine light perfectly. The early Christians read this vision during persecution, finding in it courage and consolation. To them, the woman was both mother and church, persecuted yet protected, radiant yet suffering. And in that dual meaning lay the secret of all Christian hope, that suffering and glory are not opposites, but companions. St. Andrew of Crete wrote in the 8th century, "The Theotokos is shown to us in heaven as a sign of our future resurrection. What she has received, we too shall receive in time." In her, the Church saw the completion of what it professed in faith, not only the redemption of the soul, but the resurrection of the body. Even the battle with the dragon took on new meaning. It was not only a symbol of spiritual warfare, but of victory already won. The woman, pursued yet unbroken, became the image of perseverance. Her crown of 12 stars gleamed not with conquest, but with fidelity. Thus, in the mystery of the Assumption, revelation and history intertwined. The apocalypse was not simply foretelling the end of the world, it was revealing the end of the story already begun in Mary, humanity taken back into harmony with God. Some scholars even suggest that John's placement of the vision, immediately after the sounding of the seventh trumpet, is deliberate. In Jewish tradition, the seventh trumpet heralded the day of the Lord, the moment when heaven and earth would be joined. In that context, the appearance of the woman becomes the sign that union has already begun, that heaven has opened its gates to one of earth's children. The woman clothed with the sun is thus not only a vision of triumph, but the theological heart of hope. She stands as witness that the divine plan is not abstraction but reality, that redemption is not only promised but embodied. When later centuries celebrated her Assumption, they did so not as invention but as recognition. They saw in the radiant woman of Revelation the same truth the apostles had seen at her tomb, a truth too vast to contain in words, that she who bore the eternal word had been gathered into eternal life. Even the most skeptical scholars of later ages could not ignore the poetic symmetry. The ark once lost, now found in heaven. The woman once hidden, now revealed in glory. The story that began with a humble yes in Nazareth, now thundering across the cosmos as a sign for all generations. To the faithful, it was no coincidence that John, the beloved disciple and guardian of Mary, was also the seer of Revelation. The vision was his inheritance, a final gift from the one who had become mother to him and through him to the world. Perhaps as he wrote those burning words on Patmos, he remembered her last breath, the fragrance of roses filling the room, the light that broke through stone and shadow. Perhaps the vision of the woman clothed with the sun was not a revelation granted anew, but a memory transformed into eternity. The sight of his mother in glory returned to him through heaven's veil. And perhaps that is why the passage ends not with mourning but with triumph. The dragon is cast down, the child reigns, and the woman stands radiant in the wilderness, preserved, protected, and unbroken. She is the church, she is Israel, she is humanity redeemed, but she is also Mary, the living ark, the fulfilled promise, the prophecy made flesh. The book of Revelation closes with the union of heaven and earth, the New Jerusalem descending like a bride adorned for her husband. And if one looks closely, the story has already begun in her. The woman clothed with the sun is the first glimpse of that heavenly city, radiant, adorned, alive. In her Assumption, prophecy became history, and history became hope. For John's apocalypse, terrifying as it is, ends not in destruction but in restoration. And Mary's story is the proof that such restoration is not myth, but destiny. The woman clothed with the sun is not a symbol of escape from the world, but of its transformation. Through her, heaven reveals what it intends for all creation, that the mortal will put on immortality, that light will swallow shadow, that love will outlast even the grave. And so, the prophecy stands fulfilled, not merely in vision but in her. For the ark once hidden has been revealed. The woman once weeping at the cross now reigns in joy. The bridge between heaven and earth now shines as a crown of 12 stars, and her story, whispered across millennia, continues to guide every soul that still dares to look upward and believe. The vision of the woman clothed with the sun fades, yet its radiance remains. The same light that lingered over the empty tomb, the same silence that has followed her story through the centuries. John's apocalypse had given heaven a face, but on earth a different kind of mystery endured, not in prophecy, not in poetry, but in absence. Because when all the saints were gone, when their bodies were buried, broken, or enshrined, one question remained unanswered. Where was hers? Every other saint, every martyr, every confessor left something behind. A bone, a strand of hair, a piece of cloth soaked in blood. Relics filled the ancient world like fragments of heaven fallen to earth. Pilgrims crossed deserts to kiss them, emperors fought wars to possess them. The faithful built basilicas around them, believing the divine still lingered in mortal dust. But for Mary, the Mother of God, there was nothing. No tomb containing her bones, no church boasting her relics. No fragment of garment, no lock of hair, no trace of the one who had once held eternity in her arms. In an age that treasured relics above gold, this absence spoke more loudly than miracles. It was as if the earth itself had been denied the right to keep her. By the 4th century, the relic trade had become the heartbeat of Christian devotion. The bones of martyrs were enshrined beneath altars. Their names were sung in the Mass. Fragments of the true cross were divided and sent to distant lands. Pilgrims knelt before the skulls of apostles, the veils of virgins, the sandals of prophets. Relics were faith made tangible. Proof that holiness had touched the physical world, and yet in all the records one relic is missing: the body of the Virgin. The silence surrounding it was not accidental. It was reverent, intentional, almost protective. When Emperor Constantine's mother, Helena, scoured the Holy Land in the 4th century to find relics of the saints, she discovered the cross, the nails, and the tomb of Christ. But no record tells of her finding the remains of his mother, not even a rumor. Centuries later, the great collectors of relics, popes, kings, bishops, searched every corner of the Christian world for traces of her presence. They found supposed fragments of John the Baptist's bones, Thomas's finger, Peter's chains. But not one dared to claim possession of Mary's remains. The ancient world was not shy about relics. If her body had been here, someone would have claimed it. Someone would have built a shrine. Someone would have written of its discovery with trembling awe. But there is nothing. Only the whisper of a truth too holy to be handled. The absence of relics became paradoxically her greatest relic. To the early believers, it confirmed what they already knew in their hearts, that her body was not here because heaven had taken it. The same God who raised his Son would not let the vessel that bore him see decay. St. John Damascene wrote it plainly. If her relics were preserved, the faithful would venerate them. But she was translated to the heavenly kingdom, body and soul. His words echoed what the people already believed. The lack of physical evidence was not a problem. It was proof. When pilgrims visited Jerusalem in the 5th and 6th centuries, they found churches built in her honor, but never a reliquary holding her remains. The tomb of the Virgin in the Kidron Valley was empty, yet pilgrims still knelt there, not to mourn, but to rejoice. The emptiness itself had become holy. In Constantinople, the Byzantine emperors built magnificent churches dedicated to her Dormition. Their walls glittered with mosaics showing her lifted by angels, her tomb surrounded by apostles. But beneath those altars there were no relics, no sacred bones hidden in golden caskets, only icons, flowers, and silence. It was the silence that said everything. For centuries, the faithful came to that silence not to ask where she was, but to remember why she was gone. The same absence that puzzled scholars filled believers with awe. They understood what words could not say. That holiness does not always leave evidence. Sometimes it leaves wonder. In the medieval West, when relic fever reached its height, the absence of Mary's relics became almost scandalous. Popes catalogued the sacred remains of martyrs, scholars documented every fragment of sainthood. Entire economies thrived around pilgrimage and veneration. And yet, through all that abundance, the greatest treasure remained untouchable. Theologians debated. Could it be that God had deliberately withheld her relics to protect them from corruption? Or was it a sign that she no longer belonged to this world at all? The conclusion was always the same. The Mother of God had been taken. Even skeptics were forced to admit the strangeness of the void. No early Christian ever claimed to have found her bones. No rival sect ever claimed to possess her tomb. In a world obsessed with proof, her disappearance stood as the one unexplainable fact that faith could never turn away from. Some tried to rationalize it. They suggested her body had simply vanished into legend, that time had swallowed the memory of her burial. But the early texts, from the Transitus Mariae to the homilies of the Church Fathers, insisted otherwise. They all agreed on one detail. Her body was not found. It was not forgotten. It was gone. To the mystics, this absence became a symbol of divine intimacy, that God's love does not leave behind relics because it carries the beloved completely home. They compared her to Enoch, who walked with God and was no more, and to Elijah, who rose in a chariot of fire. She had walked the earth in obedience, suffered in silence, and now her reward was incorruption. Her body, they said, had been the first tabernacle of the Word made flesh. The earth could no more hold it than night could hold the dawn. Even art reflected this truth. When painters and sculptors depicted her death, they showed her not as decaying, but as luminous. Her body glowed, her face peaceful, her hands folded. Around her, flowers bloomed, angels wept, and the apostles gazed upward as if watching her rise beyond sight. The absence of relics was replaced by presence through beauty. In the Latin West, the question of relics became a subtle form of theology. The Church did not display her bones because there were none to display. Instead, it displayed her image, icons and statues, each one pointing beyond itself to the invisible reality. The image became her relic, the prayer her tomb. And in that way, her absence became the presence that filled every church. When the dogma of the Assumption was finally proclaimed in the mid-20th century, Pope Pius XII noted this same quiet wonder. "It is impossible," he wrote, "to think of her sacred body remaining in corruption." His words did not invent the doctrine. They simply confirmed what the empty tomb and the missing relics had proclaimed for centuries. Her life had left no remains because her story was unfinished on earth. This absence continues to puzzle modern historians. They sift through records, inscriptions, and early pilgrim accounts, seeking a trace of what should have been the greatest relic in history. But they find nothing. The silence resists analysis like a locked door in an ancient cathedral that no one dares to open. Some think that silence is coincidence. Others know it is invitation. Because the absence of relics is not an argument to solve, but a truth to enter. It tells us something about the nature of holiness. That true sanctity does not cling to the world, but transforms it. That what belongs entirely to God cannot be divided, catalogued, or sold. Every saint left pieces of themselves behind, tangible reminders that they had lived, suffered, and died. But Mary left behind only faith. Her relic was her story, her yes, her continuing intercession that flows through time like unseen light. To stand before her empty tomb is to understand that the holiest things do not decay. They do not remain to be touched or traded. They ascend. That is why, even now, her absence fills the world more powerfully than relics ever could. Because absence is not always loss. Sometimes it is fulfillment. The woman who once carried the word left behind nothing because she herself had become the message. The living testament that mortality, when surrendered to grace, becomes eternal. And so when pilgrims kneel in the valley of Jehoshaphat or in the hills of Ephesus, where tradition says her house still stands, they are not seeking a fragment of bone or cloth. They are seeking the echo of what the world could not hold, the presence of one who crossed the threshold and never returned. Her relics never were because she herself is, not entombed, not relic, but revelation. The one who bore God into flesh has now become the sign of what awaits all flesh. Incorruptible, luminous, alive. And the silence that surrounds her absence is not the silence of death. It is the silence of heaven. Julam, still echoing with the heartbeat of the woman who was carried beyond corruption and who still even now prays for the world she once called home. The silence of relics, that strange and holy absence, did not end within Christendom. It echoed outward across lands and centuries until it reached another faith, one that would rise under different prophets, speak in a different tongue, and yet still whisper her name with reverence. The world changed, empires fell, languages died, but the story of Mary did not. It traveled through deserts carried by memory and faith until even in the recitations of Islam her name was spoken again. Maryam, the pure, the chosen, the one who was taken. Long after the last apostles had gone and long after Rome had risen from persecution into power, the Arabian Peninsula was still a place of wandering faiths, Jewish, Christian, and pagan traditions blending at the edges of the world. It was there in the 7th century that a new revelation was recited, words that would become the Quran. And among its verses, woven between stories of prophets and kings, was the voice of a woman already known across the world. And remember when the angels said, "O Maryam, God has chosen you and purified you. He has chosen you above all women of creation." No other woman in the Quran is named, none given a chapter bearing her name. But Maryam is spoken of again and again, not as a distant figure, but as living symbol of divine mercy and perfection. In Islam, she is Sayyidat Nisa al-Jannah, the Lady of the Women of Paradise. Her story in the Quran carries echoes of the same mystery the early church had whispered. She is chosen from birth, dedicated to the temple, overshadowed by the Spirit and greeted by angels who proclaim her blessed. She conceives the word not by human will but by divine command, be, and it is. And when she bears her child, she bears him alone in the wilderness, not among witnesses but in silence and suffering. Yet what is most astonishing is not only how much of her story survives across faiths, but what happens after it. The Quran never describes her death. It ends her story not in mourning, but in peace. In the hadiths, the recorded sayings and traditions, she is spoken of as among those who did not taste corruption. Islamic commentators from the earliest centuries, reading the Quran's reverent tone, concluded that Maryam had been taken, not by death, but by divine will. In Tafsir al-Khazin and Tafsir al-Qurtubi, medieval scholars recorded ancient reports that Maryam was raised to the heavens, her spirit and body preserved in purity, dwelling among the living in paradise. Some described her as residing in the highest of the 7 heavens among the prophets. Others wrote that when the trumpet of resurrection sounds, she will rise with them, not from earth, but from the gardens of God. It is a breathtaking parallel. Centuries separated these scriptures, yet both faiths spoke of the same woman. A woman untouched by decay, chosen not only to bear the divine word, but to transcend death itself. The Quran honors her in terms that mirror the reverence of the Gospels. It calls her Siddiqa, the most truthful, the faithful witness. It says she guarded her chastity and we breathed into her of our spirit. The very language recalls the Annunciation in Luke's Gospel. The same spirit, the same divine breath, the same overshadowing of mystery. And just as in Christian belief she intercedes through compassion, in Islam she is remembered as one who prays for those in need. Her name appears beside her sons in countless invocations. Isa ibn Maryam, Jesus, son of Mary, The pairing is deliberate, unbreakable. To honor the son is to remember the mother. Islamic mystics, the Sufis, took this further still. They saw in Maryam the archetype of surrender, the perfect mirror of the divine will. In her, they said, every soul could glimpse its own path to God, the stillness that allows the divine word to be born within. In their poetry, she is the inner sanctuary of the heart, the vessel of illumination. Jalal ad-Din Rumi, the Persian mystic, wrote, "Every one of us is a Mary, and within us there is an Isa waiting to be born." To the Sufis, the virgin birth was not a biological marvel, but a spiritual one. The symbol of what happens when the human soul becomes perfectly open to the will of God. Maryam was the human embodiment of that state: silence, surrender, and light. Even the Prophet Muhammad himself, peace be upon him, spoke of her with profound reverence. In a hadith narrated by Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, he said, "Many men attained perfection, but among women none attained perfection except Maryam, the daughter of Imran, and Asiya, the wife of Pharaoh." In another tradition, he described how every newborn is touched by Satan except for Maryam and her son, a sign of their exceptional purity. To a faith built upon the absolute oneness of God, Maryam became the ultimate human example of what it means to be chosen, yet humble, favored yet never divine. She was, in Islamic thought, the bridge between prophecy and humanity, mercy and obedience. And still, across the centuries, one cannot help but sense the echo of something older. The same quiet assumption, the same vanishing into heaven that Christian tradition had guarded in mystery. When Muslim historians wrote of her final days, they too spoke of her disappearance. Some said that when she died, the angels buried her. Others said she did not die at all. The Persian scholar al-Tabari recorded an ancient account that Maryam was raised to heaven alive, as was her son. In the writings of the Andalusian mystic Ibn Arabi, she is described as a being of light, dwelling in the eternal presence of God, her purity unending. It is as though the story that began in Nazareth refused to be contained by borders or doctrines. It passed from Hebrew prophecy to Christian gospel, from Christian hymn to Islamic revelation, leaving the same fragrance of holiness behind. Even today, Muslims and Christians visit the same places in her memory: the House of Mary in Ephesus, the Tomb of the Virgin in Jerusalem. At both sites, candles burn from both hands, prayers rise in two tongues, and the same name is whispered, Maryam. It is one of the few spaces where both faiths kneel together. In an age divided by theology and history, that shared reverence is almost miraculous. For across both traditions, she is seen not as symbol of division but of unity, the human soul at its purest, the servant of God beyond dispute. In the Quran, she is told by the angel, "God has chosen you above all women of the worlds." In the Gospel of Luke, Gabriel says, "Blessed are you among women." Two revelations, two languages, and yet the same voice, the same reverence. Both see her as the meeting point of heaven and earth, the bridge between divine will and human frailty. In Islam, she embodies the same mystery that Christians call grace. Her purity is not her own achievement, but God's gift. She becomes the perfect reflection of divine mercy, a mirror that does not distort, only reveal. And just as Christians see her assumption as proof of the body's redemption, Muslims see her preservation as proof of the soul's nearness to God. In both, she stands as promise that faith does not end in death but in return. The Quran's tenderness toward her is unlike its tone toward any other mortal. It calls her by name, comforts her in pain, speaks to her directly. When she gives birth alone, frightened beneath the palm tree, a voice calls from beneath her, "Do not grieve. Your Lord has provided a stream beneath you. Shake the trunk of the palm tree toward you. Ripe dates will fall." It is a moment of divine compassion, God meeting her in her humanity, caring not through thunder or command, but through small tenderness. That tenderness is the thread that binds the two faiths. It is not the logic of theology, but the language of love. For in both traditions she is the sign that God draws near to the lowly, that holiness can dwell in humility, that the path to paradise is not power but surrender. Even as the centuries hardened borders between faiths, her figure remained untouched. Artists from Byzantium to Persia painted her face with the same awe, eyes lowered, light surrounding her, the child near her heart. In every language, her name became a prayer. And so, across continents and scriptures, Mariam stands as the unspoken meeting place between Christianity and Islam. The bridge neither theology nor time has broken. To Christians, she is the queen assumed into heaven. To Muslims, she is the pure one taken into paradise. To both, she is proof that God's mercy can lift what is human into what is eternal. Her story reminds both worlds that holiness is not possession but reflection. That to be chosen is not to be exalted, but to be emptied of self so that God may fill the soul completely. And perhaps that is why, more than 14 centuries after the Quran was first recited, her name still carries peace wherever it is spoken. For in her, two faiths that often seem at war find a shared hope. The vision of a woman who never died as others die, but was taken, lifted gently, wholly, beautifully, to where the faithful still hope to follow. And across the long silence of history, her echo remains, not in argument, but in awe. A bridge still standing, a mother still praying, and a promise that, beyond all difference, heaven remembers us by the same name. The echo of Mariam in the Quran fades into the twilight of history, and once again the story returns to the church, to the world that first called her Theotokos, the God-bearer. Centuries of silence and devotion had already shaped her mystery into something luminous and untouchable. The faithful no longer questioned whether she was taken into heaven. They prayed it, sang it, painted it, and built their calendars around it. But it would take until the middle of the 20th century, nearly 2 millennia after her passing, for Rome to give that ancient belief its final, unbreakable form. The year was 1950. Europe was still trembling from the ashes of war. Cities lay in ruin, and faith itself had been tested by the machinery of death. Millions had seen what man was capable of when he forgot heaven. It was into that fractured world that Pope Pius XII, a man both admired and misunderstood, announced one of the most extraordinary declarations in modern religious history. On November 1st, the Feast of All Saints, beneath the vast dome of St. Peter's Basilica, he stood before thousands of pilgrims and read the words that would echo across generations. We pronounce, declare, and define it to be a divinely revealed dogma that the Immaculate Mother of God, the ever-Virgin Mary, having completed the course of her earthly life, was assumed body and soul into heavenly glory. The moment was monumental, not the creation of a belief, but its formal recognition. The doctrine of the Assumption had lived in the Church since the earliest centuries, whispered in the catacombs, sung in Byzantine hymns, and painted on walls long before theologians found words to describe it. Pius's declaration was meant to close the circle, to give voice to what faith had always known but never officially said. For the faithful, it was triumph. For skeptics, it was provocation. The declaration came not as a sudden idea, but after years of consultation. Between 1946 and 1950, the Vatican sent letters to bishops around the world asking whether their people believed the Assumption to be revealed truth. Of the hundreds who responded, the vast majority said yes, not as a new revelation, but as something already written into the heart of faith. The decision, therefore, was not innovation. It was affirmation. Pius XII described it not as discovery, but as recognition. The universal church, he said, has always believed this privilege of the Blessed Virgin to be consonant with the faith. Yet even as the Church rejoiced, the scholars began their questioning. They pointed to the silence of Scripture, to the fact that no gospel, no apostolic letter, no canonical text speaks of her death or assumption. They argued that the earliest written evidence came centuries later, from apocryphal sources like the Transitus Mariae, which the Church itself had never declared historical. To them, the assumption was not fact, but symbol, a beautiful poem mistaken for event. Theologians on the other side replied that not every truth of faith is written in ink. They reminded their critics that the canon of Scripture itself had been shaped by tradition, that oral memory, liturgy, and belief were as ancient as the texts themselves. They argued that silence is not denial. The Scriptures were silent about many mysteries, including the death of most apostles, yet the Church never doubted they had occurred. For them, the assumption was not an invention of medieval imagination, but the flowering of a seed planted by the apostles. The tomb found empty. The traditions preserved by the early believers, the continuity of devotion across continents and centuries. Still, historians pressed further. Could this story, they asked, be an echo of older myths, the ascensions of heroes, the divine translations of pagan goddesses? The Church answered that the difference was profound. Those ancient tales spoke of mortals rising by their own power or through divine lust. The Assumption spoke of a woman lifted by grace. Hers was not a conquest of heaven, but a return to it. Yet the skeptics remained unconvinced. They pointed to the lack of physical proof, the missing relics, the empty tombs, the absence of eyewitness accounts beyond the language of vision. To them, these absences weakened the claim. But to the faithful, those same absences were evidence. For how could the most sacred body in Christendom vanish unless heaven itself had claimed it? That tension between faith and reason became the defining question of the modern age. Was the Assumption a spiritual truth expressed through metaphor? Or an event in history, a miracle witnessed and remembered? The Church never asked its followers to choose between symbol and fact. It asked only that they recognize the harmony between them. As Pius wrote in Munificentissimus Deus, the apostolic constitution that proclaimed the dogma, "The Immaculate Virgin, preserved free from all stain of sin, did not see corruption of the tomb, but was taken up into heaven to join her Son." It was not about explaining how, but affirming why. In that same document, Pius referenced the early fathers, St. John, Damascene, St. Germanus of Constantinople, St. Andrew of Crete, all of whom spoke of the Virgin's incorruption. He cited the liturgies that had celebrated her dormition since the 5th century. He recalled the absence of relics, the empty tombs, and the universal sense that her body had never lain in decay. But perhaps the most mysterious part of his declaration was not theological, but personal. Pius had chosen this moment after years of private prayer. Years that included one extraordinary claim, that during the height of the Second World War he had seen the sun dance. On multiple occasions in 1950, before declaring the dogma, he reported witnessing a strange phenomenon, the same kind of solar vision the children of Fatima had described decades earlier. The light, he said, moved and shimmered in the sky as if heaven itself confirmed the truth he was about to pronounce. Historians have debated this ever since. Was it coincidence, a spiritual vision? Or did the Pope himself, like the apostles before him, glimpse light consuming the tomb of the Mother? Those who stood in St. Peter's Square that November morning swore they felt something beyond human ceremony. As the words of the dogma were read, sunlight filtered through the dome, falling across the mosaics of Mary's coronation. Witnesses described a stillness so profound that even the rustle of robes seemed like wind through ancient trees. It was as though the centuries of silence had finally found their voice. Yet the question persists, even now, 75 years later. Was this declaration the crowning of a truth or the sanctifying of legend? The documentary record, examined coldly, cannot decide. The Bible remains silent. Archaeology offers no body, no bones. History provides only the faith of millions and the art of 1,000 years. But faith has always moved through silence. The assumption, believers say, is not history remembered, but history redeemed. It is the world itself confessing that holiness cannot rot, that love cannot end in dust. It is the same truth John saw on Patmos, the woman clothed with the sun standing at the threshold of eternity. The skeptics call it poetry. The faithful call it revelation. Between them lies the same mystery that has followed her since the cross, that the holiest things often leave no evidence behind. Still, the persistence of the story defies explanation. For 2,000 years across languages and empires, the belief has never died. It has survived schisms, reformations, wars, and skepticism itself. No other teaching rooted in silence has endured with such strength, and perhaps that endurance is its greatest proof, that what began as the whisper of the apostles has become a song sung by nations. In the end, Pope Pius's declaration did not end the debate. It sanctified it. It gave the Church a truth it could hold, and the world a mystery it could never fully grasp. For to define a dogma is to draw a line between knowledge and wonder. And Mary's assumption stands exactly on that line. Scripture is silent, history uncertain, tradition unbroken, and somewhere in the midst of all three a light still burns. The same light that witnesses claimed consumed her tomb. The same light that filled her chamber at the hour of her departure, the same light that perhaps the Pope himself saw flickering in the sky above Rome. It is the light of faith, a flame that refuses to die, illuminating what reason cannot explain. And maybe that, in the end, is the purpose of her story. To remind us that truth is not always proven by what we can touch, but by what refuses to fade. The dogma stands, unshaken, because it answers something deeper than doubt. It answers the human longing to believe that death is not the end, that holiness is not lost to the grave. Whether history or symbol, miracle or memory, her assumption remains what it has always been, a promise disguised as absence. A story not about escape from the world, but about its completion. For if she was taken, it was not to leave us behind, but to show the road ahead, the path where light consumes the tomb, and where the faithful too will one day rise. The voice of the 20th century, still echoing with the solemn declaration of Pope Pius XII, fades into something older. Older than history, older than faith itself. Because for all the scholars and skeptics who debate what was or wasn't seen at her tomb, another kind of witness remains: the heavens. Long before telescopes and satellites, human eyes lifted toward the same stars that watch us still. They looked upward, searching for meaning, for signs, for a reflection of divine order in the vast cathedral of the sky. And somehow, even there, her story had already been written, mapped in light, stitched across the black canopy of creation. For centuries, theologians and astronomers alike have marveled at the way the heavens seem to remember her. The date of her feast, the 15th of August, falls at the turning of seasons, that fragile point when summer begins to bow to autumn, when the harvest begins and the earth gathers its fruits to offer back to the Creator. In the ancient world, this was the season of thanksgiving, of reaping, of return. And in that rhythm, early Christians saw a symbol that reached beyond fields and seasons. They saw the earth giving back its most perfect fruit, the Virgin herself, the first of creation redeemed. The Feast of the Assumption is not only a holy day, it is a cosmic alignment. The Church, perhaps unknowingly, placed it within a celestial order already ancient when the Gospel was new. If one stands beneath the night sky in mid-August, the constellations seem almost to tell her story. Above the horizon rises Virgo, the Virgin. Her figure stretches across the heavens, luminous and serene, holding in her hands a sheaf of wheat. For millennia, civilizations had known her by other names: Ishtar, Astrea, Demeter, symbols of fertility and divine renewal. But for the Christian world, the ancient myth found fulfillment in Mary. The Virgin holding the harvest became the Virgin bearing the Word, and the wheat in her hands became the bread of life. Every year when the Church celebrates her Assumption, the constellation Virgo begins its slow ascent into the evening sky. The ancients saw in this a sign that the earth and heavens were moving in harmony. The celestial Virgin rising as the earthly Virgin was lifted into glory. To the medieval imagination, this was no coincidence but design, creation itself participating in her exaltation. Astronomers in the Middle Ages, many of them monks, noted how the sun enters the region of Virgo around the time of her feast. The Virgin, they said, is clothed with the sun, the same imagery that John the Evangelist recorded in his vision of the woman clothed with the sun and crowned with 12 stars. The Church in turn saw that alignment as a celestial reflection of Revelation 12, a reminder that the story of the woman's triumph was written not only in Scripture but in the stars. And there too shines another constellation, Leo the Lion, just above Virgo's head, marking the place of the crown of 12 stars. The ancients counted those stars as the brightest in Leo, circling above the Virgin's brow like a diadem of light. Beneath her feet lies the moon, waxing and waning with the same rhythm that guided ancient feast days and modern calendars alike. The imagery of heaven and the words of Revelation seem to mirror each other perfectly, as though John had looked upon the same sky we still see and written what heaven itself had already proclaimed. It is easy to forget that before telescopes, faith and astronomy were not rivals but companions. The same monks who copied Scripture charted the heavens, believing that the cosmos was a second book written by the Creator. The order of the stars, their patterns and motions were not cold mechanics. They were divine language. To them, the Virgin's presence in the sky was no myth, it was testimony. The universe itself participated in the drama of salvation. Even now, modern astronomers, though speaking a different language, find poetry in that alignment. The sun's path through the constellations, known as the ecliptic, places Virgo at the heart of harvest season. The 15th of August in ancient calendars marked the great gathering of wheat and fruit, the offering of the earth's first and finest yield. When Christianity claimed that date for the Assumption, the symbolism deepened. The earth, having borne its perfect fruit in the person of Mary, now returned her to heaven, the harvest of humanity's redemption. The Feast of the Assumption thus became not only a celebration of faith, but a cosmic ritual. The Virgin rises clothed with the sun, crowned by stars, and the world below mirrors that assent with the offering of its fruits. The rhythm of heaven and earth align, creation offering back its most perfect creation. Theologians of the Renaissance saw this connection clearly. They wrote of Mary as prima messi, the first harvest, the first soul gathered from the field of mortal life into eternal glory. She was the first fruit of the resurrection, the beginning of the final harvest promised to all who follow her Son. The timing of her feast, set within the ancient cycle of reaping, was no accident. It was prophecy fulfilled in season. Even the stars themselves seem to echo this theology. In medieval star maps, Virgo's brightest star, Spica, was often labeled the ear of wheat. To the ancients, it symbolized fertility. To the Christian mystics, it became the sign of the divine seed. the Word made flesh, carried in her womb. As the constellation rises each year, Spica appears as a single spark of gold, a reminder of the grain that dies and rises again. Modern science, for all its precision, has not erased the wonder of that pattern. Astronomers can measure Spica's distance and brightness, can describe its blue-white fire in equations and data. Yet they cannot undo the story that humanity has always read in its light. For faith and science, at their best, do not contradict each other. They complete each other's sentences. The heavens are not silent. They simply speak in a language both older and grander than words. And in that language, the Assumption becomes a kind of cosmic poetry, the earth returning its most perfect gift to the Creator, the universe reflecting in light what theology declares in faith. Some scholars have gone further, tracing how Marian feasts throughout the liturgical year align with the movements of the stars. The Feast of the Immaculate Conception in early December falls, when Virgo begins to vanish from the western sky, her hiddenness reflecting conception unseen. The Feast of the Annunciation in late March coincides with her reappearance at dawn, the Virgin rising again as light returns to the world. And the Assumption, in August, finds her at her highest point in the heavens, radiant and unbroken, surrounded by the crown of Leo. It is as if heaven itself marks her life in light. The Church may not have planned these alignments, but the pattern is there, written across centuries, woven into the dance of planets and stars. For those who believe, it is not coincidence, it is revelation disguised as rhythm. The earth, too, remembers her. In Mediterranean villages, the Feast of the Assumption has always been tied to the harvest. Fields are blessed. Bread is baked from the first grains. Grapes are gathered for the first wine of the season. Farmers carry their offerings to altars adorned with lilies and wheat, symbols of purity and abundance. It is as if creation itself participates in the mystery, offering its best in gratitude for the one who offered herself completely. In those rituals, theology becomes tangible. The Virgin who gave flesh to the Word becomes the emblem of a creation that gives itself back to God. Every loaf of bread, every cluster of grapes becomes echo of her surrender. Be it done unto me according to thy word. Even modern theologians, cautious as they are, cannot ignore the poetry written into these patterns. The timing of her feast, the rising of her constellation, the harvest cycle, all converge upon a single theme: return. The world that once received its Maker through her now gives her back to him transfigured, and perhaps this is why her story endures even in an age of reason. The heavens still proclaim what no creed can contain, that creation itself is a mirror of grace, that the same God who sculpted galaxies also shaped the heart of a woman, and that when she was lifted into light, the universe itself bore witness. Astronomers may call it chance that her feast coincides with Virgo's ascension, with Spica's glow, with the turning of harvest. But faith sees choreography, a cosmic harmony between matter and meaning. The sky, like Scripture, is not random. It is revelation stretched across infinity. In that vastness, the story of her Assumption becomes something more than miracle or dogma. It becomes cosmic liturgy. The earth rising into heaven, the heavens bowing toward earth, the entire universe participating in one eternal act of return. When the Church sings of her glory on August 15th, it does not sing alone. The constellations still trace her form across the sky. The sun still clothes her. The stars still circle her brow. And beneath that ancient canopy, the fields still bow, the wheat still bends, the rivers still glisten with summer's last light. All creation remembers. For the Assumption was never meant to be confined to doctrine. It was written into the fabric of the cosmos. The heavens themselves bear witness to the truth that the story of Mary is the story of the world. the story of dust made radiant, of earth carried into eternity. And so, each year when her feast returns, the world performs the same silent ritual. The Virgin rises, the earth offers, and the stars burn quietly above, as if heaven itself has never forgotten the night when one of its own came home. The heavens remember her still. The constellations rise and fall in their ancient rhythm, the harvest comes and goes, and the earth continues its long turning beneath the same stars that once bore witness to her story. Yet even as the cosmos keeps its silent vigil, one mystery remains, the simplest and most human of all. Did she die? Did her heart, which had once beat beside the heart of God, finally fall still? Or did she simply fall asleep and wake on the other side of light? The question has haunted theologians, mystics, and believers for centuries. The Gospels are silent. The early writings differ. Some say she died as all mortals do, her soul received by her Son and her body, laid in the tomb that could not hold her. Others insist that death, which had no claim on her purity, merely brushed her with sleep. A gentle passage, not an ending. The Church has never defined which is true. It is as though heaven itself wishes to keep the moment hidden, a secret between mother and son. But perhaps the mystery is not in how she left, but in why she remains. Because everything about her story has always been about nearness, God drawing near to humanity through her, and humanity finding its way back to God through her. From the moment she said yes in Nazareth, the distance between Creator and creation began to collapse. Her final disappearance, then, is not escape from the world, but its completion. If she died, her death was unlike any other, not a rupture but a homecoming. The tradition of her dormition, the falling asleep, captures this perfectly. There is no violence, no separation, only rest. The ancient icons show her lying in peace, surrounded by the apostles as Christ receives her soul, like a newborn wrapped in light. It is the reversal of Bethlehem. Now the child holds the mother. The circle of love closes. To call it death feels too small a word for something so vast. Death ends, but hers continues. In every language, in every century, her name remains a prayer. She is not remembered as one who once lived, but as one who lives still. That perhaps is the heart of the mystery. That love is not buried, it is transfigured. Her disappearance is not absence, but expansion. The early fathers spoke of it with awe. She is not gone, wrote Saint Germanus of Constantinople. For how could she who brought forth life itself be imprisoned by the tomb? She lives, she intercedes, she reigns. To them her assumption was the final proof that death itself had been rewritten. What once consumed humanity now releases it. What once ended all stories has become through her a doorway. The Assumption is not the erasure of mortality, it is its redemption. It shows that flesh, when filled with grace, does not decay. It becomes luminous. It returns to its maker not as ashes, but as offering. That is why her story never ends in grief. The Gospels close with the resurrection of her Son. The tradition closes with her own rising, a mirror of his, a human echo of divine victory. Between them, all of creation is gathered. Theologians call her the eschaton in advance, meaning the end made visible before its time. In her, the future of humanity is revealed. A body no longer subject to gravity, a soul no longer bound by fear. She is what the world is meant to become, the first flower of a new creation. When we speak of her death, we are really speaking of our own hope. Her story tells us that the grave is not the last word. It tells us that love, once united with God, cannot die. The ancient hymn of the Dormition says, "In giving birth, you preserved your virginity. In falling asleep, you did not abandon the world." The last line is the most astonishing. You did not abandon the world, because this is the paradox of her passing, that she is more present now than she was when she walked the earth. The woman who once lived quietly in Nazareth, who followed her son through the dust of Galilee and the shadow of the cross, now moves silently through every age, every prayer, every longing heart. Millions call her name in dozens of tongues. In candlelight and cathedrals, in whispered prayers, on hospital beds, in the desert chants of monks and the songs of mothers soothing their children. She is still there. Theologians speak of intercession. Poets speak of presence. But perhaps both are the same thing. She who once interceded for a wedding couple in Cana now intercedes for a world still longing for its wine of joy. She who once carried light within her now carries our prayers to the same light. Whether she died or merely slept, the truth remains. She crossed the boundary every soul fears, and she did not vanish. She became what the ancients called the living bridge, the meeting place between mortal and immortal, between earth and heaven. The Assumption, in the end, is not about elevation but union. It is not about escape but return. The same love that once drew God into the world now draws humanity into God. There is a quiet symmetry to it all. The one who once bore life in her body is now born by life itself. The one who once gave flesh to the divine is now clothed in divinity. The woman who stood at the foot of the cross now stands at the heart of heaven. Not above us, but beside us. For her glory is not isolation, it is communion. To gaze upon her story is to see the mystery of every life that ends in grace. Each human being, no matter how small or forgotten, carries within the same divine spark that once filled her. The Assumption is not meant to distance her from us, but to draw us toward her destiny. The same destiny promised to all creation. It tells us that heaven is not a faraway place, but a home already being built within us. That death is not a wall, but a veil. That the love which shaped galaxies is the same love that will lift us when our time comes. Perhaps that is why her story has endured through every empire and every doubt. Empires fall, languages die, ideologies shift, but her image, the woman lifted into light, remains. Because it is not simply her image, it is ours, redeemed. Every generation has needed her for different reasons. To the early church, she was proof that Christ's promise was real. To the medieval faithful, she was queen and mother. To modern hearts, she is the still point in an age of noise, the quiet assurance that the divine has not abandoned the world. In art, she rises through clouds, arms open, eyes serene. Not fleeing earth, but embracing it from above. The painters never show fear in her face. They show peace. Her upward motion is not escape, but return, not rejection of flesh, but its glorification. The gravity of the world cannot hold what has become pure light. Grace, it seems, is stronger than gravity. And that is the message her story leaves behind. That holiness is not the denial of the human, but its fulfillment. That mortality, touched by love, becomes a doorway to eternity. The poets of Byzantium said that when she fell asleep, the angels paused their song to listen for her last breath, and that when it came, the sound was not sorrow, but music. The Western mystics said that the fragrance of her tomb still drifts through the world, invisible but real, the scent of incorrupt love. Every culture, every language has found its own way to describe what words cannot hold, that she did not simply go. She became. She became what love looks like when it conquers decay. And perhaps when all arguments are done, when all doctrines are dust, that is what will remain, not the proofs, not the debates, but the radiance of a story that refuses to die. Because her Assumption is not merely about one woman's exaltation. It is about the destiny of every soul. It is about what happens when grace completes its work. when the human and the divine finally meet without division. Her disappearance, then, is not loss. It is transformation. The silence of her tomb is not emptiness. It is fullness too vast for sound. The mystery of her end is not that she escaped death, but that she transfigured it. And so the story closes not with a farewell, but with a promise. Perhaps heaven's greatest secret was not that she was taken, but that she never truly left. For she remains the pulse behind our prayers, the calm at the center of our storms, the proof that the distance between dust and divinity is smaller than we think. And in the turning of the stars, in the rising of Virgo, in the scent of lilies on the wind of every August feast, the world still remembers the same truth. That love, when perfected, does not descend into the grave. It ascends. And somewhere, beyond sight but not beyond reach, the mother who once held eternity in her arms still holds the world in hers.